There is a moment, somewhere in the churning records of the 41st millennium, that most Imperial scholars would rather forget entirely. A moment that sits in the grand ledger of galactic history, like a smudged ink stain on an otherwise immaculate page. A moment so inherently ridiculous, so deeply chaotic in the most literal sense of the word, and yet so perfectly, disturbingly Ork, that it almost defies the very framework of logic the Imperium uses to make sense of its endless wars. It is the moment a squad of green-skinned soldiers, creatures, whose idea of a sophisticated plan typically begins and ends with running toward the enemy, while yelling somehow manage to infiltrate one of the most devastated and guarded industrial worlds in the sector, locate a god machine, and attempt to steal it. Not a tank, not a shuttle, a Titan, a Warlord-class Titan, one of the largest, most powerful walking war machines ever constructed by the human race. A cathedral of destruction, standing 33 meters tall, armed with weapons capable of reducing city blocks to glowing craters, protected by void shields that could absorb the fire of entire armored battalions, and home to a machine spirit, an artificial intelligence, so ancient, so proud, and so deeply territorial that even trained Imperial crews found it difficult to manage on a good day. And the Orks decided they wanted one, not to worship it, not to study it, not even really to use it properly. They wanted it the way an Ork wants anything, because it was big, it looked shooty, and nobody had told them they couldn't have it. What followed was an event that Inquisitors have quietly buried in restricted archives, that Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests reference only in hushed, horrified tones, and that Blood Axe Orks probably still talk about around their fires as the greatest achievement in the long, glorious history of greenskin theft. It is called, in the dry language of Imperial records, the Great Titan Heist of 981 of the 41st millennium. And it is, in every meaningful sense, one of the strangest stories that Warhammer 40,000 has ever produced. So, settle in, because there is a lot to unpack here. We need to understand the Orks, who they are, how they think, why they do the things they do. We need to understand what a Chaos Titan actually is, and why capturing one is not the kind of task that sane creatures attempt. We need to meet the Blood Axes, the particular clan of Orks responsible for this lunacy. We need to walk through the events that created the opportunity. And then we need to follow the Commandos into the wreckage of Canto 2, step by step, as they attempted the most audacious act of greenskin larceny in recorded history. Let us begin at the beginning. And the beginning, in any proper Warhammer 40k story, starts with understanding the galaxy itself. Section 1. The Green Tide. Understanding the Orks. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is a place of almost unrelenting horror. It is a setting defined by war without end, by darkness pressing in from every direction, and by the slow, grinding weight of a human civilization fighting to survive against threats that should, by any reasonable measure, have destroyed it long ago. There are the Tyranids, galaxy-devouring biological monsters driven by a hunger so vast it has consumed entire star systems. There are the Necrons, ancient mechanical warriors who were old when the universe was young and who have no particular feelings about waking up and reclaiming what they consider theirs. There are the Eldar, the Tau, the Drukhari, and the countless warbands and cults of chaos spilling out of the corrupted regions of space known as the Eye of Terror. And then there are the Orks. The Orks occupy a strange and singular place in the ecology of this doomed galaxy. They are, by almost any objective measure, the most numerous intelligent species in existence. They outnumber the humans of the Imperium. They vastly outnumber every Eldar craft world. They cover more worlds, claim more systems, and field more individual warriors than any other faction. Were the Orks ever to truly unite under a single, undisputed warlord with a coherent strategy, the resulting tide of green violence would almost certainly end the galaxy as a place where anything other than Orks existed. This is not an exaggeration. This is a genuine, deeply unsettling truth that the Imperium strategists lose sleep over. And yet the Orks have never managed it, not for long, not completely. And the reason for this has everything to do with what Orks fundamentally are. To understand Orks, you first need to understand their biology, because their biology explains almost everything about their behavior. Orks are not really animals in the traditional sense. even though they look and act like ones. They are more accurately described as a fusion between fungal life forms and animal biology. They reproduce through spores. When an orc dies, those spores release into the environment and eventually grow into new orcs. This means that an orc infestation, once established, is almost impossible to fully eradicate. You kill the orcs, but you scatter the spores. The orcs come back. This is why the only truly definitive way to remove orcs from a planet is exterminatus, the total destruction of the world itself, turning it into a dead rock where nothing grows. And even then, you have to do it before the spores drift off into space. Orcs are green because their cellular structure contains something functionally similar to algae, a biological mechanism that makes them exceptionally tough to kill and gives them access to rapid cellular repair. An orc can take wounds that would kill a space marine and keep fighting. Orc war bosses, the largest and most battle-hardened specimens, can survive injuries that would be lethal to almost any other species in the galaxy. They feel pain, certainly, but their relationship with pain is fundamentally different from any human experience of it. An orc gets cut in half, and his first instinct is not to die. It is to try to bite whatever cut him. They grow. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about orcs. They physically grow larger in proportion to how many battles they fight and how much they win. A newly grown orc, called a snot, or a snotling in its smallest form, is barely knee-high to a human. A young orc boy is roughly the size of a large human adult and proportionally more muscular. But a veteran orc who has fought in hundreds of battles, who has won, who has earned status and teeth, can grow to enormous sizes. Knobs and war bosses can stand 2.5 meters or more, with musculature that looks like it was designed by someone who had only ever heard humans described and then built their version of one out of industrial components and bad decisions. This growth is connected to something remarkable. Orcs are latently psychic as a species. Individually, the psychic resonance of a single orc is barely detectable. But collectively, as more and more orcs gather together in the frenzy of a building crusade, their shared psychic energy begins to accumulate into something that the galaxy's scholars have named the Greenskin Gestalt, a field of raw belief that subtly bends reality to match what orcs expect. This is why orc technology works. By any rational measurement, the ramshackle guns that orc mech boys weld together out of spare parts and wishful thinking should not function. The metallurgy is wrong. The engineering principles are violated. The tolerances are catastrophic. A human engineer presented with an orc firearm would conclude, correctly, that it should not be able to fire without destroying itself in the process. But it does fire, because the orcs believe it will. Red vehicles go faster because every orc knows red ones go faster, and enough orcs believing something with enough conviction actually makes it so through the distortion of reality that their collective psychic field generates. Yellow explosives make bigger explosions. Blue paint is lucky. These are not superstitions in any dismissive sense. They are facts about a species that has, through sheer shared belief, bent the physical laws of the universe to accommodate their preferences. The social structure of orc society is almost insultingly simple, and yet it works with a terrible efficiency. The largest, strongest, most battle-hardened orc is in charge. That is it. That is the entire system of orc governance. If a bigger orc appears and challenges the current boss, they fight. The winner leads. This means orc leadership is in a constant state of violent flux, with subordinates always testing boundaries and war bosses always needing to prove their dominance through increasingly impressive demonstrations of destructive capability. Within this broad hierarchy, there are specialist castes, encoded genetically into the orc race by the beings who created them, a topic we will return to. Mech boys are the engineers, possessed of an instinctive, almost supernatural understanding of machinery. They require no education, no training manuals, no apprenticeships. They emerge from their fungal pods already knowing, somewhere in the deep instinctive parts of their brain, how to build things that go bang, and how to fix things that have already gone bang too many times. Pain boys are the medics, equally driven by instinct, equally terrifying in their methodologies. Weird boys are the psychers, conduits for the massive collective psychic energy of the horde, capable of channeling it into devastating reality-bending effects. Though the process tends to be deeply unpleasant for everyone nearby, including the Weird Boy himself. And commandos, but we will get to them shortly, because they deserve their own introduction. The term for an Ork crusade, a full-scale mobilization of greenskin forces, gathering around a charismatic warlord and sweeping across space to fight everything in sight, is a war cry. The mechanics of it are almost self-sustaining. A war boss wins battles. Winning battles makes him grow. Growing makes him more imposing. More imposing draws more orcs to his banner. More orcs means more psychic energy. More psychic energy means orc technology becomes more effective. More effective technology means bigger victories. And so the cycle accelerates, feeding itself, until a single orc warlord stands at the center of a green tide that can sweep entire sectors from the map. The nightmare, the scenario that keeps Imperial strategic planners awake in cold sweats, is a war boss who keeps winning, who grows enormous, who draws millions, then hundreds of millions, then billions of orcs to his banner. The galaxy has seen such figures. The most terrifying was a being known only as the Beast, an orc warlord of such incomprehensible power that he came within a hair's breadth of destroying the Imperium of man entirely during the era now known as the War of the Beast. His Gargants, the massive orc warwalkers built as sacred effigies to the orc gods, were of a scale not seen before or since. The largest among them, encountered on the world of Ullanor, was described as being the size of a hive city, but orcs are defined as much by their divisions as their power. The clans of orc society, the Goths, the Blood Axes, the Evil Sons, the Death Skulls, the Snakebites, the Bad Moons are in constant rivalry with one another. They cooperate when a strong enough warlord forces them to, and they fight each other the moment he stops paying attention. This internecine violence bleeds off energy that might otherwise be directed outward, and it is, in a deeply ironic way, one of the only things that has kept the orcs from conquering the galaxy outright. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that often gets overlooked in discussions of the orcs. They are not simply brutes. The species was created deliberately engineered by beings called the Old Ones, the ancient precursor civilization that shaped much of the galaxy's intelligent life as part of an effort to fight the Necrons and their Cetan masters in a conflict so ancient it predates human history. The Krork, as the original versions of the orcs were called, were a bioengineered weapon. Their technology, their aggression, their near indestructibility, their ability to breed in impossible numbers, all of it was designed. The Old Ones built the perfect warrior species, and then lost control of it. The orcs have been fighting ever since, a self-sustaining engine of war that no longer needs its creators, no longer has any particular master, and has no real goal beyond the act of fighting itself. This, in a very real sense, is what makes them so terrifying. They are not conquerors in any traditional sense. They do not want your resources or your territory in any lasting way. They do not want to rule you. They want to fight you. They want to fight everyone. And when there is nobody left to fight, they will fight each other until someone comes along to fight again. The galaxy is a gymnasium to the orcs, an endless arena provided for their enjoyment, and the other species are the weights. And somewhere in this vast, violent, gloriously unhinged culture, a specific orc on a specific day decided that what his warband really needed was a titan. Before we go further, take a moment and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. This kind of video takes a long time to put together, and it means everything to see where you're all tuning in from. If you're enjoying this so far, hit subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it helps more than you know. Section 2. God Machines and Daemon Engines. What makes a Chaos Titan? Before we can appreciate the full, magnificent insanity of what the orcs attempted, we need to understand exactly what a Titan is, not in the abstract, vague sense of knowing it is large and dangerous. In the specific, concrete, deeply detailed sense of understanding what this machine represents, how it functions, what lives inside it, and what happens when something goes catastrophically wrong with it. A Titan is, at its most basic level, a bipedal war machine of enormous size. But that description strips away everything that makes a Titan what it actually is, which is something that exists at the intersection of technology, religion, and consciousness in a way that nothing else in the Warhammer 40k universe quite matches. The Imperium calls its Titans God Machines, and they mean this with complete sincerity. The Warlord-class Titan, the specific type relevant to our story, stands approximately 33 meters tall. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the height of a 10 to 11-story building. Now imagine that building as a walking, armed weapons platform. Imagine it draped in void shields that can absorb weapons fire, capable of penetrating tank armor. Imagine it carrying arm-mounted weapons, bellicosa, volcano cannons, Sunfury plasma annihilators, macro Gatling blasters that individually outperform the main armament of smaller warships. Imagine additional weapons mounted on its carapace. Apocalypse missile launchers, capable of saturating entire city blocks with detonations. Turbo laser destructors that punch through void shields and super-heavy armor alike. A single Warlord Titan deployed to a battlefield does not change the course of a skirmish. It ends the skirmish. Its firepower can neutralize an enemy position in minutes. Its stride length of 20 meters means it can cross terrain that would take infantry hours in a fraction of the time. Its void shields can absorb fire from enemy Titans, heavy artillery, and mastless cannon salvos while barely registering the impacts. It is, functionally, a walking fortress, a weapons platform, and a symbol of absolute destructive dominance, all folded into one towering form. But a Titan is not simply a machine. It is not a tank or a shuttle or a gun emplacement that can be operated by anyone with sufficient training. A Titan is alive in every way that matters. At the core of every Titan is what the Adeptus Mechanicus calls a machine spirit, an entity that is not quite an artificial intelligence in any modern sense, and not quite a soul in any spiritual sense, but something uncomfortably close to both. Over millennia of service, a Titan's machine spirit develops personality, preferences, moods, and something that can only be described as pride. Older Titans, those that have fought in thousands of battles across centuries, have machine spirits of such complexity and such fierce independence that even trained crews must approach them with something approaching negotiation rather than command. The crew of a Warlord Titan is not simply a group of operators sitting at control stations. The command crew, the Princeps, who commands, and the Moderati, Sensori, and Steersman, who assist, are connected to the Titan through mind impulse units, neural interfaces that create a direct link between human consciousness and the machine's systems. The Princeps, in particular, enters a state that is more than controlling a vehicle and less than becoming one. Through the manifold, the Titan's sensory interface, the Princeps perceives the battlefield through the Titan's sensors as though they were extensions of his own body. He feels the impacts against the void shields as pressure. He feels the heat of the plasma reactor as warmth. In the most fully integrated patterns of Warlord, the Princeps resides in an amniotic tank, physically immersed in fluid, almost completely surrendered to the experience of being the machine. The longer a Princeps serves in this capacity, the more deeply intertwined they become with their Titan's machine spirit. Veterans of decades of service report difficulty distinguishing their own thoughts from the machine's responses. The Titan begins to anticipate commands. The human begins to adopt the Titan's rhythms. In extreme cases the Adeptus Mechanicus documents in restricted medical archives, the boundary between crew and machine begins to dissolve in ways that are deeply unsettling to contemplate. The construction of a Warlord Titan is not a matter of weeks or months. It takes years, sometimes decades, to build a single one. The materials must be refined to extraordinary standards. The plasma reactor at its heart, the fusion engine that powers everything, must be assembled by tech priests who have spent their entire careers learning the rites and rituals of its construction. The void shield generators require components that are, in some cases, literally irreplaceable, dependent on knowledge preserved in manuscripts that exist in only a handful of copies across the Imperium. When a Titan dies in battle, when it is destroyed beyond recovery, the loss is mourned like the death of a saint, because in many ways it is. This is why the phrase traitor Titan carries such particular horror in Imperial history. During the Horus Heresy, the apocalyptic civil war that tore the Imperium apart 10,000 years before our story, not only did Space Marine legions turn against the Emperor, but so did portions of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the great technocratic priesthood that maintained the Imperium's technology. And where the Mechanicus went, so went its Titans. entire Titan legions declared for the War Master Horus. They turned their weapons on their former brothers. They marched on Terra itself. When the heresy failed, when the traitor forces were broken and driven back, these renegade legions fled to the Eye of Terror, the vast region of space where the warp, the psychic dimension of reality, bleeds into the physical universe. And in the Eye of Terror, something happened to them over the 10,000 years that followed. The warp is not a neutral environment. It is the realm of chaos, of the four great chaos gods, of daemons and psychic corruption, and the slow dissolution of anything stable and ordered. A machine that spends long enough in the proximity of the warp does not simply rust, it changes. The machine spirits of the traitor titans, already proud and fierce entities, began to absorb the energies of the chaos gods. They became corrupt in a very literal, very physical sense. The machines mutated. Metal that had been smooth and cold began to sprout organic growths. Weapon mounts developed what could only be described as sinew. Exhaust vents developed openings that looked disturbingly like mouths. The machine spirits stopped simply being fierce and became something that could only be described as wrathful, hateful, hungry. The Dark Mechanicus, the renegade technocratic faction that serves chaos, the dark mirror of the Adeptus Mechanicus, performs rituals on these corrupted machines that deepen the transformation. Daemons are bound into the machine's systems, not replacing the machine spirit but merging with it, creating entities that are neither purely mechanical nor purely spiritual, but some horrifying fusion of both. A fully corrupted Chaos Titan is not a vehicle with a pilot. It is a daemon engine of staggering power, guided by something that has both the tactical cunning of an ancient war machine and the feral, bloodthirsty rage of a creature born in the warp. The crews of Chaos Titans are, in many documented cases, no longer separable from their machines. The Princeps, after centuries of service and deepening neural integration, is physically fused to the machine's systems, their body partially converted into biological circuitry, their consciousness merged with the daemon that inhabits the Titan's core. They are no longer operators, they are components. They serve willingly because they have long since lost the capacity to want anything other than what the Titan wants, and the Titan wants only destruction. A Chaos Warlord-class Titan, sometimes designated the Banlord when dedicated to Khorne the Blood God, carries weaponry similar to its Imperial counterpart, but modified and augmented by 10,000 years of Dark Mechanicus innovation. Doomfist weapons, Chaos Energy Whips, Havoc Missile Racks. These are added to the standard arsenal of volcano cannons and plasma weapons, creating platforms of destruction that can fight for extended periods without resupply, that regenerate damage through daemonic processes that defy standard engineering, and that exude a psychic aura of terror and malice, powerful enough to rout entire armies. A single Chaos Titan on the field does not merely destroy the enemy's forces. It attacks their morale, their sanity, their will to continue fighting. The ground trembles when it walks. The air shimmers with warp taint in its proximity. Soldiers who have faced them in battle report years of recurring nightmares afterward, if they survived at all. Now imagine this machine, this fusion of ancient Imperial engineering and demonic corruption, this walking nightmare of steel and sorcery, and 10,000 years of hate, and imagine a group of orcs deciding they want to steal it. To understand how they thought that was a reasonable idea, we need to understand the Blood Axes. Section 3. The Sneaky Gits, the Blood Axe Clan. Of all the Orc clans, the Blood Axes occupy the strangest position in Greenskin society. They are, by any fair measurement, the most militarily sophisticated of the major Orc clans. They use camouflage. They employ tactics. They understand the concept of strategic withdrawal, of retreating from a losing battle to fight another day, which is a concept so alien to the Orc mindset that most Greenskins would rather die than acknowledge it as a valid option. They have been known to work alongside humans as mercenaries. They trade with the Imperium for equipment. They have learned to read Imperial Gothic well enough to steal tactical manuals. Every single one of these things marks them as dangerously un-orky in the eyes of every other clan. The Blood Axes are roundly mocked, deeply distrusted, and occasionally attacked by their fellow Greenskins for these behaviors. The Goths, the most traditionally brawl-focused of the major clans, regard blood axes with the same contempt that a professional wrestler might feel towards someone who refuses to get in the ring and insists on solving problems through negotiation. The evil sons think they are cowards. The snakebites think they have been corrupted by too much contact with the soft races of the galaxy. Even the Death Skulls, themselves not precisely admired for upstanding conduct, look sideways at blood axes, with the faint suspicion that there is something not quite right about orcs who wear camouflage. The blood axes, for their part, could not care less. They have internalized a simple truth that most orcs never manage to grasp, that in warfare, winning is better than fighting, and anything that makes winning more likely is worth doing, regardless of how un-orky it might appear. This philosophy produced the Commandos. Commandos are the elite special operations units of the blood axes, and they represent something genuinely unusual in the orc world. Orcs who are not only willing to be quiet, but who have made an art form of it. A commando's tools are silence and surprise. Where a regular orc boy's approach to combat involves running at the enemy as fast as possible while making as much noise as possible, a commando creeps. He waits. He observes, he identifies weak points. He selects his moment, and then, when the moment comes, he and his squad erupt from concealment with the kind of sudden, targeted violence that maximizes damage and minimizes the enemy's opportunity to respond. They paint themselves in camouflage poorly, often in colors that bear no relation to the actual environment they are operating in, because the commandos understand the concept of camouflage, but have not quite figured out how to implement it effectively, but they try, which puts them miles ahead of every other orc in the galaxy. Their preference for soot-blackened blades over noisy guns speaks to a discipline that other orcs find genuinely baffling. The idea of voluntarily not shooting when shooting is an option is something that most orc boys cannot compute. Each commando unit has a structure, with individual members assigned specialist roles. There is always someone who handles breaching, getting through doors, walls, vehicle hatches, whatever stands between the squad and the objective. There is always a burner boy who carries an incendiary weapon for situations where subtlety is no longer required. There is always a big shoot-a-gunner for the moment when subtlety ends and firepower begins. And there is typically a mech boy or two attached to the squad, because many commando objectives involve machinery, and you need someone who can make machinery do what you want it to do, or at least make it do something dramatic. The blood axes as a whole are also distinguished by their relationship with looted technology, where the Death Skulls are pure scavengers, grabbing anything they can from any battlefield and building something new out of the wreckage. The blood axes are more selective. They steal specific things. They steal things they can use. They steal vehicles they can drive, weapons they can operate, and in the grandest tradition of blood axe ambition, things that are much, much bigger than they should reasonably be trying to steal. It was the blood axes, according to the records of several different Imperial sources, who first began developing what their mech boys call the big thing theory, the notion that if you can steal something small, you can steal something big, and if you can steal something big, you can steal something really big, and there is no logical ceiling on how big a thing you might steal if you are sufficiently cunning. The fact that the orcs who developed this theory have generally found that reality imposes its own ceilings has not deterred subsequent generations from trying. A blood axe's warboss is a particular kind of orc, not simply the biggest fighter in the group, though he is certainly that. Not simply the most aggressive, though he is certainly that as well. He is also, in his own deeply idiosyncratic way, a strategist, a planner, someone who looks at a battlefield and thinks not just about who to hit first, but about how to arrange the hitting to produce the maximum effect. Blood axe warbosses have won battles that by rights should have been impossible, through the simple expedient of approaching them more cleverly than anyone expected. Orcs to be capable of. Warboss Mardrug was, by all accounts, exactly this kind of orc. The specific details of Mardrug's broader campaign at the time of our story are somewhat murky in the historical record, which is typical, as the Imperium tends to minimize the documentation of events that make greenskins look particularly capable. What is clear is that Mardrug commanded a significant blood axe force operating in a region of space that had been thoroughly destabilized by recent conflicts. His warband was large enough to be a serious threat to Imperial holdings, but small enough to be mobile, fast, and capable of operating without the lumbering logistical requirements of a full-scale greenskin crusade. He was, by Ork standards, patient. By Blood Axe standards, he was almost cautious, and he had a habit, documented in recovered communications between Imperial commanders dealing with his warband, of hitting targets when they were already hurt from someone else's attack, of finding opportunities in other people's disasters and exploiting them with surgical precision. He was, in other words, exactly the sort of Ork who would look at a Tyranid attack on a Forge world and see not a catastrophe, but an opportunity. Section 4. Before the Storm, the Forge world of Canto II. To understand what made Canto II vulnerable, we need to understand what it was before it was attacked, and what it meant to the Imperium. Forge worlds are the industrial heartlands of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They are not gentle places. A Forge world is, by design and by necessity, a world given over entirely to production. The atmosphere is replaced by industrial byproducts. The land surface is covered in manufactorums, massive factory complexes, stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The sky is permanently occluded by the output of processing plants, refinery stacks, and the exhaust from thousands of plasma reactors running at continuous output. The population of a Forge world is not a civilian population in any conventional sense. The majority are servitors, humans who have been surgically converted into biological components of industrial machinery, their higher cognitive functions removed and replaced with specialized task programming, their bodies augmented with mechanical systems that make them more efficient at specific manufacturing processes. They do not experience the suffering of their condition because they no longer have the neurological infrastructure to suffer. They simply work endlessly until they break down and are replaced. Above them are the tech priests, the ordained members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who manage the production processes, maintain the sacred rites that keep the machinery functioning, and conduct the endless prayers and rituals that the cult Mechanicus believes are necessary to keep the machine gods satisfied. A Forge world's tech priest hierarchy is as complex and as rigid as any military command structure, and in many ways more so, because the hierarchy carries not just administrative weight, but religious weight as well. The Fabricator General, at the top of a major Forge world's hierarchy, is simultaneously a factory manager, a high priest, and a military commander. Canto II was not the most famous of Forge worlds. It was not Mars, the red heart of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or Metallica, or Graia, or any of the great industrial planets whose names appear in the histories of the Horus Heresy and its aftermath. It was a secondary world, producing war material for the sectors around it, ammunition, replacement components, vehicles, weapons systems, and the supporting infrastructure that keeps a region of Imperial space functional across the endless attrition of its many wars. Secondary does not mean unimportant. In the logistical arithmetic of the Imperium, a single Forge world feeds the military needs of dozens of systems. When a Forge world goes dark, supply lines break, armies run short of ammunition, ships cannot be repaired. The consequences ripple outward and are felt for years afterward in increased casualties, reduced effectiveness, and the slow erosion of Imperial control over the affected region. Canto II had, attached to its defense forces, a Titan, specifically a Warlord-class Titan of a pattern designated in the records as the Mars Alpha, the most common and most respected variant of the Warlord design. The Titan had a name, the Wrath of Cassiopeia, and it had a history, because Titans always have histories, because Titans live long enough to accumulate them the way old soldiers accumulate scars. The specific history of the Wrath of Cassiopeia before our story is not fully preserved in accessible Imperial records. What is known is that it had served Canto II's defense for a considerable period, that its machine spirit was regarded by its crew as aggressive, even by warlord standards, and that its maintenance had been a matter of ongoing concern for the Forge world's tech priests, as the machine's personality required careful, constant management to keep it from acting on its own initiative in ways that were not always convenient or controlled. A Titan with an aggressive machine spirit is not necessarily a problem. Aggression in a war machine is largely a desirable trait. The problem arises when the machine spirit's aggression is not adequately managed, when the systems that mediate between the machine's instincts and the crew's commands are strained or damaged, and the Titan begins to express its own preferences rather than following its crew's orders. Under normal circumstances, experienced crew and regular maintenance rights prevent this from becoming an issue. Under circumstances that are not normal, say, circumstances in which most of the crew is dead, the maintenance rights have not been performed, and the machine has been forcibly boarded and its systems interfered with by a group of creatures who have no idea what they are doing, the situation can deteriorate rapidly. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Tyranid splinter fleet that struck Canto II was not, by Tyranid standards, particularly large. Tyranid fleets, in their full manifestation, are not measured in ships but in organisms, biological warships numbering in the hundreds, accompanied by clouds of smaller craft and swarms of atmospheric assault organisms. What hit Canto II was a splinter, a fragment broken away from a larger fleet, perhaps diverted by an earlier Imperial engagement, perhaps simply following a biological imperative toward inhabited worlds with large concentrations of organic material. In terms of the Tyranid threat across the galaxy as a whole, it was a relatively minor incursion. In terms of what it did to Canto II, it was devastating. Tyranids do not attack like conventional forces. They do not identify strategic objectives and plan their approach. They swarm. They infiltrate in advance through the use of genostealers, organisms designed to blend into local populations and begin the process of subversion from within. They descend in waves of biological organisms designed for specific combat roles, each one integrated into a gestalt intelligence that coordinates the assault without the need for explicit communication. They bypass fortifications not by attacking them directly, but by going around them, above them, through them, under them, wherever the greatest concentration of biomass is accessible. The defense of Canto II was heroic, in the particular way that heroic things in the 41st millennium tend to be ugly, costly, and ultimately successful only in a very qualified sense. The Wrath of Cassiopeia proved invaluable, its weapons devastating the Tyranid biotitans that formed the heavy assault elements of the fleet's ground forces. Its void shields shrugged off the biological weapons fire that devastated lesser installations. Its stride carried it across the most critical battle lines at precisely the moments when the defenses were on the verge of collapse. But every Titan engages at cost. Void shields absorb energy, but they can be depleted and require time to regenerate. Weapons fire depletes ammunition stockpiles that must be replenished. The plasma reactor at the Titan's heart runs hotter with every sustained engagement, and cooling it requires time and technical expertise. And the crew, the human beings connected to the machine through neural interfaces that share the experience of battle with the Titan directly, accumulate stress, fatigue, and psychological damage that recovery rituals can address but not fully erase. By the time the Tyranid splinter fleet was driven away, not destroyed, because Tyranid organisms are rarely destroyed, but driven off, disrupted, forced to abandon the assault before the hive mind's objectives were met, Canto II was in a state that could charitably be called recovery, and more accurately be called ruin. The surface damage was extensive. Many of the largest manufactory complexes had been breached or destroyed. Servitor populations had suffered catastrophic losses. The tech priest hierarchy had been decapitated in several of its middle ranks as the organism sought out and killed anything that organized intelligent resistance, and the Wrath of Cassiopeia itself was damaged. Not destroyed, the machine had survived far worse, but damaged in ways that had not yet been repaired when the more important of the two threats it faced arrived on Canto II's sensor screens. The second threat was smaller, quieter, far less obvious than a Tyranid swarm. It arrived not in a fleet of biological horrors, but in a single, nondescript vessel that identified itself, when challenged by the overwhelmed and partially functional defense grid, as a civilian transport diverted by the war zone and requesting emergency docking clearance. The vessel was crewed entirely by Orks. Section 5. DeBoss has a plan. Mardrug and the Titan Heist. In the oral tradition of the Blood Axes, the story of the Great Titan Heist is told with considerable embellishment. The version that circulates among orc boys sitting around fires between raids tends to involve more explosions, more violence, and a significantly more triumphant conclusion than the historical record supports. But the core of it, the concept, the audacity, the sheer magnificent nerve of it survives intact through every retelling, because it is, at its heart, a story about exactly the kind of thing blood axes believe themselves capable of. Warboss Mardrug had been watching Canto 2. For how long is unclear. The records of Imperial intelligence during this period are fragmentary, for reasons that will become apparent, but the surviving pieces suggest that Mardrug's warband had been operating in the general vicinity for at least several months prior to the Tyranid attack. Whether he had prior intelligence about the Splinter Fleet, which would require resources and connections that would be impressive even by Blood Axe standards, or whether he simply positioned himself opportunistically near a strategically valuable target and got lucky with the timing, is a question that historians debate. What is not debated is that Mardrug identified the moment of maximum vulnerability with impressive precision. The Tyranid assault was in its final phase, still intense enough to keep all of Canto 2's defensive attention focused on the biological threat, but close enough to conclusion that the planet's defenders had begun the transition from active combat to damage assessment and recovery. This is, in military terms, an extremely dangerous period. Forces are physically and psychologically exhausted. Command structures are disrupted. Communication systems are partially or fully down. Attention is focused inward, on the catastrophe that has just occurred, rather than outward, toward threats that have not yet arrived. Mardrug had, before the attack, assembled a very specific team. Not a full warband, not hundreds or thousands of orcs surging forward in an overwhelming tide. A small group, a precise group, chosen for specific capabilities. The core of the team was a mob of commandos from Mardrug's finest Blood Axe infiltration unit, veterans of multiple successful penetrations of fortified Imperial positions. These were not orcs who had stumbled into stealth work because they were too small to fight. These were specialists who had chosen this path, who had developed skills over years of practice, who knew how to move through hostile terrain without being detected, how to neutralize security systems, how to identify the critical vulnerabilities of a target, and how to time an assault for maximum effect. With them came a group of mech boys. Not just any mech boys, but specifically those who had demonstrated a particular fascination with large machinery, with engines, with power systems, with the internal workings of things that required teams of specialists to operate. These were mechs who had, in previous campaigns, managed to start captured Imperial vehicles, to get destroyed tanks running again, to restore power to dead systems in ways that their human counterparts would have considered somewhere between miraculous and terrifying. Mardrug's theory was, by Orc standards, elegant. Canto 2 had a Titan. The Titan was damaged. The world was in chaos from the Tyranid attack. Nobody would be watching carefully. His team would go in, find the Titan, get it started, and bring it out. The flaws in this theory were numerous and significant. The Wrath of Cassiopeia was a warlord-class Titan, a machine so vast and so complex that even its own crew trained specialists, who had spent years learning to interface with it, found it temperamental. The idea that a group of orcs, however talented by orc standards, could simply climb aboard and drive it away the way you might steal an unattended vehicle was not really a plan so much as an aspiration. But the Blood Axes have always been better at the first part of a plan than the subsequent parts, and Mardrug, for all his intelligence by orc standards, was still an orc. He believed it would work. His mech boys believed it would work. And in the orc psychic framework, belief has a way of making things work, at least up to a point. The transport vessel they used had been acquired through methods that the historical record politely describes as irregular acquisition, and less politely describes as having been stolen from a minor Imperial trading concern approximately 6 months prior, and modified to remove most of its obviously orc-related features. This is another Blood Axe specialty, the looted ship, modified to look roughly like what it is pretending to be, carrying identification codes either stolen or fabricated well enough to pass initial scrutiny from overwhelmed or distracted security forces. The orcs who crewed it were disciplined enough, by orc standards, to behave approximately like a crew in distress rather than a crew looking for a fight, though this required considerable effort and occasional violence among themselves to maintain. The transport slipped through Canto 2's defense grid during the period when half of the grid's sensors were non-functional and the other half were occupied with tracking, retreating Tyranid organisms, and assessing the damage to the planet's defensive infrastructure. The story of how they convinced the defense network's automated systems to accept them is a minor masterwork of blood axe cunning, involving stolen identification codes, a fabricated distress signal, and a willingness to calmly respond to increasingly suspicious queries from the few human operators still at their stations, with answers that were just plausible enough to delay action. They docked. They came out. And they began, in the wreckage of a still-smoking forge world, to look for their target. Finding a 33-meter-tall walking war machine should not have been difficult. And in fact, it was not. The Wrath of Cassiopeia was in a maintenance bay complex in the central manufactory district, an enormous enclosed space built specifically for the maintenance and repair of heavy war engines. The bay itself was largely intact. The Tyranids had targeted the production facilities, not the maintenance infrastructure, because their primary interest was in biological material, not in wrecking manufacturing equipment they had no use for. The Titan sat in the bay, surrounded by scaffolding and the detritus of interrupted repair work. Her void shield generators were partially dismantled, with components laid out on work tables where tech priests had been in the middle of maintenance when the Tyranid assault disrupted everything. Several weapon systems were offline. The plasma reactor was running at reduced output, and the crew? The crew was elsewhere, resting, recovering, or attending to other duties while their Titan underwent its repair cycle. This was the window. This was the moment. The commandos moved through the deserted maintenance bay with the practiced efficiency of their training. They neutralized the handful of servitor guards, barely functional maintenance servitors, not combat models without significant difficulty. They established a perimeter, and then the mech boys got to work. Section 6. Inside the God Machine, the boarding. What happened inside the Wrath of Cassiopeia in the hours after the Ork boarding team infiltrated the maintenance bay is reconstructed from several sources, none of them entirely reliable. There are the subsequent reports filed by the Titan's surviving crew when they returned to find their machine gone. There are the accounts of witnesses on Canto 2 who observed what happened next. And there is a tradition among Blood Axe mech boys of a specific oral account almost certainly embellished, possibly dramatized beyond recognition of what the boarding party experienced inside. The interior of a Warlord Titan is not designed for easy navigation by unauthorized personnel. It is not a friendly place, even for its own crew. The passageways are narrow in places, overwhelmed by conduits and cabling, and the infrastructure of a machine that has been built up, modified, repaired, and augmented over centuries of service. The mechanical systems are almost entirely unlabeled in any language that an Ork would be likely to read. The noise from the plasma reactor, even at reduced output, is continuous and intense. The heat radiates through the walls, and lurking in all of it, in the systems that regulate the machine and integrate its components, is the machine spirit. The machine spirit of the Wrath of Cassiopeia was not passive during the boarding. This is documented in the subsequent crew reports with some precision. The machine systems began registering the presence of unauthorized personnel within approximately 7 minutes of the boarding team's entry. What the machine spirit could not do, damaged as its systems were, with half its management infrastructure dismantled by the interrupted maintenance, was respond effectively. It attempted to alert the crew. The alert systems were offline. It attempted to activate internal security protocols. Those systems required input from the Princeps's command station, which was uninhabited. It attempted to engage its own limited autonomous responses, and it began, as best it could, to resist. The Ork mech boys described the experience of working inside the Titan during this period as like working inside something that was angry with them. This is not metaphorical by Ork standards. The machinery fought them. Conduits that should have been passive produced unexpected discharges. Control panels that the mechs managed to access responded to input in ways that were inconsistent with what the mechs expected, as though someone else was also operating them. The temperature in the sections the boarding team worked through kept increasing beyond what the reactor output would account for. Doors sealed, hatches locked. The Titan, within the limits of its ability to act, was trying to expel them. This is not unprecedented. Machine spirits in the Warhammer 40k universe are real, and they have genuine agency. An Imperial Titan's machine spirit is not simply a program. It is an entity that has preferences and can act on them within the constraints imposed by its crew's authority and its own system's integrity. A machine spirit that believes its crew is in danger will act to protect them. A machine spirit that believes its systems are being violated will act to resist the violation. And the wrath of Cassiopeia's machine spirit, by every account, was one of the more assertive ones, even under normal circumstances. The mech boys, for their part, were not discouraged by this. Orc mech boys have a relationship with machinery that is almost entirely unlike anyone else's. For a human tech priest, a machine that resists you is a problem to be solved through the correct application of rights and technical expertise. For an orc mech boy, a machine that resists you is evidence that the machine has spirit and is therefore worth fighting. And orcs know how to fight. One mech boy, described in the oral tradition by a name that translates approximately as Rusty Fingaz, is said to have actually begun arguing with the Titan's control systems, the way you might argue with another orc who is being uncooperative, loudly, physically, and with a great deal of hitting the relevant surfaces with tools. Remarkably, and in a way that perfectly illustrates how orc psychic field effects operate, this seemed to partially work. The mechs' absolute conviction that they could start the Titan, combined with their genuine talent for mechanical improvisation, managed to interface with the Titan's systems in ways that the machine's own design had not anticipated and could not fully resist. Where the correct technical approach would involve carefully following the correct rites of activation in the correct order, the mech boys' approach involved bypassing as many intermediate steps as possible and going directly to the plasma reactor's ignition sequence through methods that any trained tech priest would describe as criminally reckless. The plasma reactor came online, not fully, not properly, not with any of the careful, calibrated management processes that a full activation sequence would involve. But it came online. The Titan's power systems lit up. Lights in the maintenance bay flickered and died as the power draw from the wrath of Cassiopeia's awakening systems overwhelmed the local grid. The scaffolding around the Titan began to shudder as its systems came to life. External sensors activated. The Titan began, in a limited and extremely poorly managed way, to function. What the mech boys could not do, had never been able to do, had perhaps never seriously planned to address, was control what happened next. Because the machine spirit of the wrath of Cassiopea had been waiting. Section 7. Disoriented and enraged. The rampage. Here is something important to understand about a Titan's machine spirit, and about what happens to it when it is activated incorrectly. Under normal circumstances, when a warlord Titan is brought to active status, the process takes hours. The plasma reactor is carefully brought up to operating temperature through a sequence of stages. The void shields are tested and calibrated. The weapon systems are checked, rights spoken over each one, the connections between them, and the central control architecture verified. And most importantly, the crew, the princeps and moderati and sensori are connected to the machine through the mind impulse units in a gradual, carefully managed process, establishing the neural link between human consciousness and machine intelligence in a way that allows both sides to adjust to the experience. This process exists for a reason. The machine spirit of a warlord Titan, when it first comes online from dormancy, is in a state of heightened alertness. It is powerful. It is ancient. It has accumulated the experiences of countless battles over centuries of service, and those experiences have made it, in the language that best applies, aggressive. The management protocols exist precisely to mediate between this aggression and the need for the machine to function in coordination with its crew, rather than acting purely on its own instincts. The wrath of Cassiopea had been activated without any of these protocols. Its reactor had been brought online through methods that bypassed every safeguard. There was no crew in the neural interfaces. There were no rights spoken. There were no connections established. There was only the machine spirit, ancient and fierce and proud, snapping into full awareness in a damaged body, surrounded by the psychic impression of the tyrannid assault it had just endured. With a group of small creatures, it did not recognize scrambling through its systems. The machine spirit reacted the way that any ancient, powerful, aggressive entity reacts when it wakes up injured and confused in an unfamiliar situation. It raged. The accounts of what happened next are consistent across multiple sources, and they describe approximately 40 minutes of complete and catastrophic chaos. The Wrath of Cassiopeia took its first step inside the maintenance bay. Given that the maintenance bay, though built for large vehicles, was not built for a fully operational warlord titan, moving under its own volition, with no crew guidance, and no particular concern for the infrastructure around it, the results were significant. The scaffolding that surrounded the machine was obliterated instantly. Support columns that had held the bay's roof for decades were snapped. The roof itself began to buckle. A dozen servitors who had been going about their maintenance duties in the facility and had not been cleared away in the chaos were destroyed by the Titan's first few steps. The Titan oriented itself as best it could, with damaged sensory systems providing incomplete and disorienting input toward the largest open space it could detect, which was the exterior of the maintenance complex. The maintenance complex had large bay doors, designed to allow Titans to move in and out. These doors were closed. The Titan did not attempt to open them. The Titan walked through them. Outside the maintenance complex, on the partially damaged but still broadly functional surface of Canto II's central manufactory district, the Wrath of Cassiopeia emerged into the gray light of the planet's perpetually overcast sky. And for a moment, according to witnesses who survived to describe it, it simply stood. Its head section moved slowly from side to side in the way that Warlord Titan's sensory arrays do when they are scanning. Though with the jerky, irregular quality of a system functioning on insufficient data, then it began walking. Where it was walking to is a matter of debate. The machine spirit, by the reconstruction offered in subsequent tech priest analyses, was in a state of profound disorientation. Its sensory systems were providing incomplete information. Its management protocols were non-functional. The Princeps's interface was empty, and the absence of that guiding consciousness left the machine spirit with nothing to anchor it, nothing to mediate between its instincts and the external world. It was, in a very real sense, alone in a way that a Titan's machine spirit is never supposed to be alone. And its instincts, without guidance, defaulted to what the Wrath of Cassiopeia had done for centuries when it was alone with an enemy. It attacked. The first weapon discharge came approximately 12 minutes into the rampage. A carapace-mounted weapon, one of the few systems that had come online at full functionality, discharged a salvo that struck a refinery processing tower, approximately 400 meters from the maintenance complex. The tower was not a military target, it was infrastructure, but it was the largest structure in the machine's damage sensor range that was registering as something solid, and the machine spirit, in its disoriented fury, struck at it. The resulting secondary explosions from the refinery's fuel reserves were visible from orbit. The Ork boarding team, still inside the Titan, discovered at this point something that should perhaps have been obvious from the beginning, that when a 33-meter-tall war machine decides it is going to move and fire its weapons, there is very little that the occupants of its interior can do to prevent this, short of having the technical knowledge and the nerve to manually shut down the reactor. The mech boys, to their credit, attempted this. The machine spirit, to nobody's surprise, resisted it. What followed was described by the surviving mechboy accounts as a running fight through the machine's internal systems, the Orks trying to reach specific control nodes, the Titan's own infrastructure fighting them every step of the way, the machine's autonomous defenses activated and lashing out at the intruders, in whatever way the damaged systems could manage. The commandos, meanwhile, did what Orks do when things are collapsing around them. They held on and looked for an exit. Several of the boarding party were killed during the rampage, by a combination of the Titan's own motion throwing them into walls, the internal defense systems, and the occasional weapon discharge, whose recoil translated into bone-breaking internal shockwaves. The survivors eventually found their way to external access hatches and evacuated the Titan in the only way still practical, by dropping from a height of between 5 and 15 meters onto whatever was directly below them, which was, in several cases, not ground. Outside, on the surface of Canto II, the Wrath of Cassiopeia continued its rampage. The description of those 40 minutes, assembled from witness accounts, and the post-event structural assessments commissioned by the Adeptus Mechanicus, reads like a document from a nightmare. The machine moved in irregular patterns, firing weapons apparently at random, striking at things that its damaged sensors registered as threats, or possibly at things that the machine spirit's traumatized consciousness simply wanted to destroy. Two additional manufacturing complexes were heavily damaged. A transit network connecting several districts was severed at multiple points when the Titan crossed it, its feet treating the infrastructure as non-existent. A command post that had been established for the ongoing damage assessment of the Tyranid attack was destroyed, killing several senior tech priests who had survived the biological assault only to be caught in the collateral damage of what had replaced it. And then, the plasma reactor reached its limit. This was, in retrospect, inevitable. The activation sequence the mech boys had used was not simply unorthodox. It was dangerous in ways that even the mechs had not fully appreciated, because they lacked the technical knowledge to understand what they had done. The reactor had been brought to full output capacity too quickly, without the staged management process that prevents the system from accumulating unmanageable thermal stress. The machine spirit, in its disoriented state, had not compensated. The result was a feedback cascade, a chain reaction of thermal and plasma buildup that could not be vented fast enough. The wrath of Cassiopeia overloaded its own reactor. The explosion was not, technically, nuclear in the conventional sense, but it was close enough that the distinction felt academic to everything within the immediate radius. The Titan was destroyed, not salvageably damaged, not repairable, but destroyed. The machine that had served Canto II for decades, that had fought in its defense against Tyranids and in previous conflicts that the records only partially document, was gone. The crater where it fell became, in subsequent years, a feature of Canto II's geography significant enough to merit a name on local maps. The boarding party, mostly evacuated before the final moments, scattered across the surrounding area. Most of them eventually made it back to the transport vessel. Warboss Mardrug's magnificent plan had, by any objective measure, failed. The Titan was gone. The mission objective was not achieved. The Orks had not driven their stolen god machine back to wherever they had intended to take it, or used it against their enemies, or done any of the things that Mardrug had presumably envisioned when he hatched this scheme. But the rampage had happened, and the consequences of the rampage were significant enough that the question of whether the mission was a failure becomes considerably more complicated. Section 8, The Aftermath. What the Titan heist actually achieved. Failure, in the narrow sense of the mission's stated objective, was absolute. The Orks did not steal the Titan. They did not use it effectively against any enemy. They did not bring it home. The wrath of Cassiopeia was destroyed, and its destruction was, in a technical sense, caused by the Orks' interference, rather than by any direct Ork action. The mech boys started a process they could not control, and the machine destroyed itself. But let us consider what the rampage actually did to Canto II. The Forge world was already in a state of severe damage from the Tyranid attack. The manufacturing output that was still functional had been redirected toward emergency repair of the most critical systems. The tech priest hierarchy was depleted and disorganized. The planetary defense network was partially non-functional. In this state, the loss of two additional manufacturing complexes, several transit network segments, a command post staffed by senior personnel, and the ongoing structural damage to multiple other facilities represented a compounding of the disaster that had already occurred. Imperial administrative records from the period following the Great Titan Heist note, with the characteristic understatement of bureaucratic language, that the incident on Canto II had affected supply to numerous Imperial war zones. This is the language of a document written by someone trained to minimize alarming information. What it means, in practice, is that the military operations of several neighboring sectors found themselves short of critical supplies, ammunition, replacement parts, weapon systems, the thousand mundane necessities of modern warfare, at precisely the moment when those sectors were dealing with their own escalating threats. Wars that might have been won were prolonged. Positions that might have been held were abandoned. Soldiers who might have had the materials they needed to fight effectively found themselves in desperate situations. The ripple effects of 40 minutes of a disoriented Titan's rampage, itself the result of a botched Ork theft attempt, propagated outward through Imperial logistics for years afterward. This is, perhaps, the most darkly elegant thing about the Great Titan Heist, from any perspective that is not the Imperium's. Mardrug set out to steal a Titan. He did not steal it. What he did instead was destroy it, and damage a forge world that was already damaged, and extend the consequences of a Tyranid attack that had already been devastating. None of this was intentional. There was no master plan. There was an Ork with a big idea and a talented team, and they caused more damage to Imperial capacity by failing than they would have caused by succeeding. The Adeptus Mechanicus response to the event was characteristically focused on the specifics of the loss. The wrath of Cassiopeia was mourned. Investigation into how the machine's plasma reactor had been activated and destabilized without the proper rites led to several modifications in how maintenance-based security was managed across Forge worlds in the affected region. The specific sequence of improvised activation that the Ork mech boys had discovered, the shortcuts that bypassed the normal safety systems, was analyzed, documented in restricted archives, and then, in a move that will surprise nobody familiar with the Adeptus Mechanicus, immediately classified as potentially heretical knowledge, ensuring that the lessons learned could be accessed by approximately 7 people who had sufficient clearance. The Imperial Guard and the broader military apparatus of the Imperium noted the event with somewhat more practical concern. The idea that Orks could even accidentally, even by failing at their actual goal, cause this level of disruption to a Forge world was filed under the category of threats that needed to be taken more seriously, and contributed to a broader review of how secondary and tertiary Forge worlds manage security during recovery operations. Warboss Mardrug's fate is not clearly documented in the historical record. The Orks clearly escaped Canto II in their modified transport vessel. The evidence of subsequent Blood Axe activity in the region suggests the warband remained intact. Whether Mardrug considered the mission a failure in his own estimation is an interesting question. By the standards he had set himself, it was. By the standards of what actually happened, the argument could be made that the Great Titan Heist was one of the most damaging single operations conducted by any Ork warband in the region during that period. The damage done to Canto II's already strained production capacity exceeded what a direct assault by a force many times Mardrug's size would likely have achieved. The Blood Axe oral tradition, predictably, resolves this ambiguity by simply not acknowledging it. In the Ork version of events, the Titan Heist was a triumph. The Titan was definitely stolen. It was driven across the planet, causing magnificent destruction. The Orks escaped. The Humies were made to look stupid. This is not accurate by any objective measure, but it captures something true about the Ork experience of the event. They did a thing that no Ork had ever done before. They went into the machine, they turned it on, and they watched it walk around, causing devastation before they left. From a certain angle, especially if you are an Ork, that is not a failure. That is a story worth telling. And there is another consequence of the Titan Heist that deserves attention, one that goes beyond the logistics of Imperial supply lines and Forge world production capacity. The Titan that was destroyed was an Imperial Titan. It was not a Chaos Titan. The event that the records call the Great Titan Heist involved an Imperial Warlord-class Titan, damaged and vulnerable in the aftermath of a Tyranid attack, being boarded by Ork commandos and mech boys who activated its reactor and were then unable to control the result. But the precedent, the bare fact that Orks had done this, had implications that extended to other types of Titans and to other scenarios. The conceptual barrier had been crossed. Orks had entered a god machine. Orks had started a god machine. Orks had, however briefly and however chaotically, been inside the system of one of the most powerful war engines in the galaxy and interfered with its function. The question of whether this could be done to a Chaos Titan, and what would happen if it were, is one that subsequent Ork warbands and subsequent Chaos encounters would eventually explore in the way that all Ork exploration happens, by doing it and seeing what occurred. Section 9. The Chaos Titan question: would Orks try it again? Before we consider the broader implications of Orks and Chaos Titans, it is worth pausing on what a Chaos Titan represents differently from its Imperial counterpart, because the differences are significant and they matter enormously for any hypothetical boarding action. An Imperial Titan's machine spirit, however aggressive and proud and resistant to unauthorized access, is not actively hostile in the existential sense. It is a powerful entity with preferences, but those preferences are rooted in a fundamental orientation toward order and purpose, toward the combat missions it was built to perform, toward the protection of the crew it has learned to recognize, toward the maintenance of the systems it depends on. When it resists unauthorized boarding, it is acting defensively. When it goes on a rampage in a damaged and disoriented state, it is expressing confusion rather than intent. A Chaos Titan's machine spirit is something fundamentally different. Over 10,000 years of exposure to the warp, of demonic merger, of the deliberate dark mechanicus rituals that bind entities of chaos into mechanical systems, the machine spirit of a Chaos Titan has become something that no longer has the Imperial Titan's orientation toward purpose and order. It has become feral in a way that goes beyond simple aggression. It is possessed, in the most literal sense of that word, by entities whose desires and impulses are not mechanical at all, but demonic. The daemon bound into a Chaos Titan's systems does not want to complete mission objectives. It does not want to protect its crew. It wants, with an intensity that the word want does not quite capture, to cause suffering and destruction on the largest possible scale. The ritual binding that the dark mechanicus performs keeps this daemon in harness, pointed in a general direction, coordinated with the traitor Titan Legion's broader objectives. But the binding is not a cage so much as a partnership, a deal made with an entity that would happily kill everything within reach if it were not pointed at specific targets. What would happen if Orks boarded a Chaos Titan? The first and most obvious difference is that the machine would not simply resist them defensively. The daemon within it would actively hunt them. The internal spaces of a Chaos Titan, already hazardous from a purely physical standpoint, would become something worse, an environment in which the machine itself was trying to kill the intruders with the full intent and enthusiasm of a possessed entity, rather than the defensive reactions of a disoriented machine. Spirit. Conduits would discharge lethally. Hatches would trap rather than simply seal. The systems themselves would become weapons. The second difference is in what would happen if the reactor were started. A damaged Imperial Titan, its management protocols bypassed, went on a rampage, driven by disorientation and the machine spirit's unchecked aggression. A Chaos Titan started without proper control would not be disoriented. It would not be confused. The daemon within it would know exactly where it was, exactly what was happening, and would have very clear ideas about what it wanted to do with this restored mobility and firepower. The result would not be 40 minutes of random destruction. It would be targeted, deliberate, enthusiastic massacre on a far larger scale, directed at whatever the daemon considered most deserving of its attention, which, depending on which chaos god the Titan was dedicated to, could mean anything from the nearest concentrations of living beings to the most sacred or fortified positions in the area. The Ork gestalt field that allows mech boys to operate machinery through belief and instinct rather than technical knowledge would face a challenge it had not encountered with the Imperial Titan. The Imperial machine resisted through protective instinct. The Chaos machine would resist through hostile intent. The daemon would recognize the Ork psychic field and respond to it not necessarily with fear, because daemons do not, as a rule, fear Orks, but with the kind of focused attention that entities of pure malice tend to give to things that are in their space. And yet there is a reason to think that Orks would try it anyway. Because the core Ork impulse, the fundamental drive that underlies everything the Greenskins do, is not strategic or tactical or even particularly coherent. It is the desire for a bigger fight, for something more impressive, for the next challenge. The Great Titan Heist showed Orks that god machines could be entered. It showed them that a Titan's reactor could be started, however chaotically. It showed them, crucially, that the result was magnificent devastation on a scale that even Orks found impressive. The lesson that a human military planner would take from this, that the risks outweighed the benefits, that the technical barriers were prohibitive, that the potential for catastrophic self-destruction was unacceptably high, is not the lesson that Orks took. The lesson Orks took was that the inside of a Titan is wild, and the results are spectacular, and next time they should try it with something even bigger. And the Chaos Titan, corrupted, daemon-possessed, radiating malice and warp energy, warped beyond recognition from its original Imperial form, is not something that would deter Orks. It would attract them. The more dangerous it is, the more impressive the fight. The more the machine resists, the better the story of having gotten into it will be. And if the result involves even more magnificent destruction than the Wrath of Cassiopeia managed during its 40-minute rampage, then by Orc standards, the outcome has been improved. This is not rationalization or speculation about Orc psychology. This is what actually happens when Orcs encounter things that should terrify them. Tuska the Daemon Killer, one of the most celebrated Orc war bosses in recorded history, intentionally led his warband into the Eye of Terror, the most demonically contaminated region in the galaxy, the place where the warp bleeds into reality most strongly, and where the Chaos God's power is at its greatest. He went there because he had fought a daemon on his ship, and enjoyed it, and he wanted more. He found a daemon world, and he and his entire warband fought the daemons there until everyone died, at which point Khorne, the blood god, was so impressed by their enthusiasm that he resurrected them all to keep fighting forever. Tuska's response to being killed and resurrected in the Chaos God's own realm, there to fight eternally against demonic generals, he was delighted. This was exactly the fight he was looking for. This is the Orc mentality, and it is the mentality that makes the idea of Orcs attempting to board a Chaos Titan not a matter of if, but of when, and whether anyone survives to tell the tale. Section 10. Gork and Mork. Why the Orcs and Chaos are more connected than you think. There is a theological wrinkle to the Orc story that does not get discussed often enough, and it is one that adds a layer of eerie complexity to any encounter between Orcs and the forces of Chaos. The Chaos Gods Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh are entities of the warp given form and power by the collective emotional and psychological output of conscious beings. Khorne feeds on violence and bloodshed. Tzeentch feeds on ambition and change. Nurgle feeds on despair and disease. Slaanesh feeds on pleasure and excess. This is why they care about the mortal races, why they tempt them and corrupt them and offer them power in exchange for devotion. Because mortal souls, pouring their fear and desire and rage into the warp, sustain and empower the Chaos Gods. The Orcs are supposed to be cut off from this. The Old Ones, who created the Orcs, deliberately blocked their connection to the warp not completely, but in a way that prevents the Chaos Gods from corrupting them the way they corrupt humans. The Greenskins' psychic energy does not flow into the realm of chaos. It flows into the collective Orc gestalt field, sustaining Gork and Mork, the Orc gods of war, instead. Gork and Mork. This is where things get philosophically strange. Gork is described as brutally cunning. Mork is described as cunningly brutal. The distinction matters to Orcs in ways that are extremely difficult for non-Orcs to parse, but the essential character of both is the same. They are warp entities, born from the collective psychic energy of the Orc species, manifesting as gods of violence and conflict. They are, in the technical terminology of Warhammer 40k's, theology, chaos entities, in the sense that they are beings of the warp, given form by mortal belief. But they are not servants of the four chaos gods. They are something separate, something that the Orc psychic gestalt created independently, something that reflects the Orc species' own nature rather than the corrupting desires of entities opposed to humanity. This means that when Chaos encounters Orcs, the theological framework does not align the way it would if Chaos were encountering humans. Daemons can tempt humans with power, with desire, with fear. They can find the weaknesses in human psychology and exploit them. They can corrupt because humans have the kinds of longings and terrors that Chaos feeds on. Orcs have no such weaknesses. You cannot tempt an Orc with power he already believes he is the most powerful thing in his immediate vicinity. You cannot tempt him with desire. His desires are simple and immediate. You cannot corrupt him through fear. He does not feel fear in any way that a Chaos God can exploit. And you cannot corrupt him through his psychic connection, because that connection goes not to the Chaos Gods, but to Gork and Mork. This is why Tuska's warband could charge through the Eye of Terror and fight demon worlds without being corrupted into Chaos servitors. They were fundamentally incompatible with the corruption mechanism. They fought, they killed, they died. They were resurrected by a god who appreciated their violence, but they did not become servants of Chaos. They remained, at every step, entirely themselves. And this is why an Orc boarding a Chaos Titan is an encounter between two fundamentally incompatible forms of supernatural violence. The daemon within the Titan would find itself dealing with creatures whose psychic signature it could not read in the usual way, whose psychological vulnerabilities it could not exploit, and whose response to its attempts at intimidation would be enthusiastic aggression rather than paralysis or terror. Would the daemon find this frustrating? Almost certainly. Would it make the Orks more dangerous to the Titan? Arguably. An enemy that cannot be intimidated and cannot be corrupted must be killed. And killing things is something Orks are very good at when properly motivated. And there are very few things that motivate Orks more than a machine that is actively trying to kill them. The Ork relationship with chaos is therefore not one of vulnerability to corruption, as it might be for humans, but one of direct, enthusiastic physical confrontation. Orks do not fear chaos. They fight it, the way they fight everything, with the full force of their bodies and their weapons and their magnificent, invincible belief that they will win because they are Orks and Orks win. Whether that belief is sufficient against the full power of a daemon-possessed Titan is a question the universe has not yet provided a clean answer to, but the Orks will keep trying until they find out. Section 11. The bigger picture, what the Titan heist tells us about the 40k universe. Step back from the specifics of the Great Titan heist for a moment, from the Orks, the machine, the rampage, the crater, and consider what the event represents in the context of Warhammer 40k as a setting. The 41st millennium is defined by the Imperium of man's slow, grinding struggle to survive in a galaxy that wants it dead. The threats are enormous and varied and seemingly endless. The Tyranids consume, the Necrons reclaim, chaos corrupts and destroys, and through all of it, the Orks simply fight for the joy of fighting, in numbers that are impossible to fully comprehend. One of the things that makes Warhammer 40k compelling as a setting, what gives it its particular atmosphere. Its specific texture is the combination of genuine darkness with something that can only be described as absurdist dark comedy. The universe is horrifying, yes. The suffering is real, the stakes are real, the losses are real. But it is also a universe in which Orks exist, and where Orks exist, a kind of anarchic humor is always present, bubbling up through the relentless grimness like something you cannot quite suppress. The Great Titan heist is this combination in its purest form. It is a story about one of the most powerful war machines ever built, a sacred object of the Imperium's techno-religion, a vessel of ancient consciousness and accumulated history, being entered by creatures whose idea of technical expertise is hitting machinery with a wrench until something happens. The gap between the gravity of the object, a god machine, a cathedral of destruction, a vessel of millennia, and the nature of the people attempting to steal it is so vast that it becomes funny in a way that genuine tragedy rarely is. And yet the consequences are real. The devastation is real. The supply disruptions ripple outward and cost lives. The loss of the Wrath of Cassiopeia is a genuine blow to the Imperium's capacity in the region. The comedy of the situation does not mitigate the suffering it causes. This is precisely the balance that Warhammer 40k maintains at its best. The universe is absurd and horrifying simultaneously, and neither quality cancels out the other. The Titan heist is also a story about unintended consequences, which is a theme that runs through the Warhammer 40k setting with a relentlessness that suggests deliberate design. Plans go wrong. Actions produce effects that nobody anticipated. The best-laid schemes of war bosses gang aft Agli, to adapt the poet. Mardrug planned to steal a Titan and use it. Instead, he destroyed a Titan and devastated a forge world, achieving more strategic damage through failure than he would have achieved through success. The Tyranids attacked Canto II to harvest its biomass, and instead created the conditions for a subsequent disaster that wrecked the planet's industrial capacity far more thoroughly than any splinter fleet. The Adeptus Mechanicus built a machine with a personality so aggressive and so independent that when it lost its crew, it went on a rampage without any external instruction. Every chain of events in this story is a sequence of unintended consequences, cascading from an original decision into outcomes that nobody planned for. This is the 41st millennium in miniature, a galaxy so complex and so violent that cause and effect are almost completely uncoupled, and the most significant results of any action are invariably the ones nobody thought about when they decided to do it. It is also worth considering what the Titan heist says about the nature of the Ork threat specifically. The Imperium of Man has a tendency, documented extensively in its own strategic analyses and psychological profiles of its enemies, to underestimate the Orks. This is partly because the Orks encourage underestimation through their cheerful, violent, apparently brainless exterior. It is partly because the Imperium, with its deep investment in the idea of humanity's superiority, is psychologically reluctant to take seriously the idea that a species of fungal warriors, governed by whoever hits hardest, could constitute an existential threat. But the Titan heist, specifically the Blood Axe's role in it, demonstrates something that the Imperium's strategists would be wise to remember: that Ork intelligence is real, Ork cunning is real, and Ork ambition extends to targets that should, by any rational calculation, be completely beyond their reach. Mardrug did not attempt to steal a Titan because he had carefully calculated the probability of success and determined it was favorable. He attempted it because he wanted it, and he had a plan. The plan failed. But the attempt itself, the bare fact of it, the genuine effort and skill that went into the infiltration of Canto II and the boarding of the maintenance bay, reflects a capacity for complex, multi-step, target-specific operations that the Imperium's worst-case scenarios for Ork military capabilities do not always account for. The Blood Axes are the most extreme expression of this, but the tendency is present across Ork society. Orks who have lived and fought long enough develop cunning. War bosses who reach the top of a large warband hierarchy have, by definition, survived situations that required more than simple aggression. The Ork who reaches the age and size of a veteran war boss has won enough fights, solved enough tactical problems, and navigated enough internal politics to constitute a genuinely formidable military mind, however alien its operating principles. The galaxy would be a somewhat safer place if the Imperium understood this more fully. It would be somewhat less interesting, but safer. Section 12. Legacy and Echoes, What Came After. The Great Titan Heist of 981 of the 41st millennium did not end with the destruction of the Wrath of Cassiopeia. Its effects continued to ripple outward for years afterward, in ways both practical and conceptual. In practical terms, the most immediate consequence was the supply disruption already discussed, the cascading effect of Canto II's reduced production capacity on the military logistics of the surrounding sectors. This played out over several years in the form of extended campaigns that should have been shorter, in defensive lines that broke under pressure that better supplied defenders would have held, in the quiet, uncelebrated deaths of soldiers and civilians whose fates were shaped by events they never knew had occurred. The Adeptus Mechanicus responded to the event with the thoroughness for which they are known in administrative matters, if not always in strategic planning. New security protocols for Titan maintenance facilities were developed and implemented, not universally, not immediately, but eventually. The specific vulnerabilities exploited by the Ork mech boys were analyzed and addressed through both technical modifications to the activation systems and new ritual requirements in the rites of maintenance. Future boarding attempts of the same type would face additional barriers. This assumes, of course, that future boarding attempts would use the same type, which is not the Ork way. The Blood Axes in particular have a long institutional memory for successful improvisation and a complete lack of institutional memory for specific technical procedures. The detailed sequence that Mardrug's mech boys improvised was probably never replicated exactly, because Ork mech boys do not replicate procedures exactly. They do what feels right in the moment, and what feels right in the moment is always somewhat different from what felt right the last time. The Adeptus Mechanicus therefore addressed a threat that no longer existed in quite the form they were addressing, while the actual threat continued to evolve in directions they were not watching. In the Blood Axe oral tradition, the Titan heist became a touchstone. For subsequent generations of Commandants and mech boys, it was the example that proved the concept. If you are cunning enough, if you put together the right team, if you find the right moment, you can get into anything. The fact that the attempt had not, strictly speaking, succeeded was papered over by the emphasis on the audacity of the attempt and the spectacular nature of the result. The Titan did walk around, causing devastation. The Orks did get out alive. By the standards of a story told around a fire, these things counted. What the Titan heist also established, in the broader consciousness of the war zone, was that Orks were capable of a level of strategic initiative that went beyond the traditional understanding of greenskin military behavior. Subsequent Imperial commanders in the region began factoring in the possibility that Ork operations might not always look like what Ork operations had looked like before. This was a small adjustment in strategic thinking, and not one that produced dramatic results in most cases. But in the margins of military planning, in the notes added to threat assessments, and the additional questions asked during intelligence briefings, it represented a change, a grudging acknowledgement that the Orks who fought in this region had demonstrated capabilities beyond the expected. The specific question of Chaos Titans and Ork interference with them is one that the historical record has not definitively answered. There are accounts, some documented in restricted inquisitorial files, some circulating only in Ork oral tradition of subsequent attempts, of other boarding operations in other contexts, of results that range from catastrophic to merely messy. None of them replicate the precise circumstances of the Great Titan heist, because the universe that Warhammer 40k describes never quite repeats itself in the same way. It is too vast, too varied, too full of parties with incompatible intentions colliding in unexpected places for any scenario to play out the same way twice. But the Orks are still out there. Mardrug is gone, or at least absent from the records, his fate absorbed into the general obscurity that swallows most Ork war bosses eventually. His warband, or what remained of it, continued to operate in the region. The Blood Axes as a whole continued their tradition of too cunning for their own good military operations. And somewhere in the galaxy, in the vast and dimly lit spaces between the stars, there are almost certainly Ork mech boys who have heard some version of the Titan heist story and are looking at some damaged, vulnerable piece of machinery that they definitely should not touch and thinking, we could start that. It would be brilliant. It would probably cause a massive explosion and kill several of us, but it would be brilliant first. This is the Ork way. It was the Ork way before the Horus Heresy. It was the Ork way when the beast nearly ended the Imperium. It will be the Ork way long after the current wars are concluded and new ones have begun. The green tide does not stop. It does not rest. It does not run out of enthusiasm or ideas or willingness to attempt things that should not work. And occasionally, in the most peculiar and roundabout way imaginable, those things work just enough to matter. The Great Titan heist was a failure. It was a magnificent, irreplaceable, deeply characteristic failure. And in the Ork tradition, a failure that ends with a 33-meter walking war machine rampaging across a forge world for 40 minutes before destroying itself in a plasma overload is not really a failure at all. It is a story worth telling. Section 13. Gork's Own Luck. The Psychic Factor and What Science Cannot Explain. There is one final element of the Great Titan heist that deserves its own examination, because it points to something important about how Ork operations work on a level that goes beyond the tactical and into the genuinely strange. The Ork mech boys managed to start the wrath of Cassiopeia's plasma reactor. They did this without the correct rights, without the correct technical knowledge, without the correct tools, in many cases. They did it by improvising, by hitting things that seemed relevant, by connecting components that seemed like they should be connected, and this is the part that tech priests find most disturbing when they analyze the event, believing that it would work. The belief is not incidental. In the Ork psychic framework, belief is functional. The collective psychic energy that the Ork gestalt generates does not simply sustain Gork and Mork. It actively bends the physical world to accommodate what Orks expect to be true. This is well documented in the operation of Ork technology. Guns that should not fire, do fire. Vehicles that should not move, do move. Explosive devices made of components that have no business being assembled the way they have been assembled do explode with the expected results. When the mech boys believed they could start the Titan's reactor, they were not simply being optimistic. They were channeling the latent psychic energy of the Ork warband through the medium of their mechanical instincts and applying it to a technical problem. The result was not the same as what the correct rights would have produced. The reactor came online unstably, dangerously, without the management protocols that would have made it safe, but it came online. The machine spirit was awakened, the power systems activated. This has an implication that is deeply uncomfortable for the Adeptus Mechanicus and has been quietly suppressed in most of their formal analyses of the incident. The sacred rites that tech priests perform when operating Imperial technology are not entirely different from what Ork mech boys do. Both involve the application of focused intent, of belief in a specific outcome, of ritual behaviors that channel something, whether the Omnissiah's favor or the Ork psychic gestalt into the machinery. The mechanisms are different. The cosmologies that frame them are different. The aesthetic is radically different. But both are, at some fundamental level, forms of psychic technology, of consciousness interacting with machine systems in ways that pure material engineering does not fully explain. The Adeptus Mechanicus would be horrified by this framing, but the evidence of the Great Titan Heist supports it. The Orks started a god machine through a combination of mechanical improvisation and sheer psychic conviction. It did not work well, but it worked. And this raises the question of what would happen if Orks developed a more refined version of this capability, if, over time and through accumulated experience, the best Ork mech boys began to develop approaches to non-Ork machinery that were more consistent and more effective. The Death Skulls have been looting and modifying Imperial vehicles for as long as anyone can remember. The Blood Axes have been stealing and operating human technology for generations. Each generation of mech boys learns from the previous one through the accumulated knowledge stored in the Ork genetic code and through oral tradition and through the time-honored Ork educational method of doing things until they either work or explode, and noting which outcome occurred. The Wrath of Cassiopeia was possibly not the first Titan that Ork mech boys had ever interfered with. It was simply the most documented case, because the aftermath was spectacular enough to leave evidence that survived the Adeptus Mechanicus's subsequent cleanup efforts. There may be other instances, smaller and less dramatic, where Orks entered damaged war machines, poked around, and left without the machine going on a rampage. These would not have been documented, because they would not have produced consequences significant enough to trigger the kind of investigative attention that generates records. In other words, the Great Titan Heist may not have been the beginning of Ork mechanical ambition. It may have been the first time that ambition was tried at sufficient scale to produce results that could not be ignored. The implications of this for the ongoing relationship between Orks and the machines of war in the 41st millennium are left as an exercise for the reader. But the short version is, the Orks are learning. Slowly, chaotically, unpredictably, in the way that Orks learn everything through violence and enthusiasm and a complete disregard for the warnings of anyone who has tried this before, but learning. And the machines of the galaxy, Imperial and Chaos alike, should probably be concerned about that. Section 14. What this means for Chaos. The Daemon Engine's nightmare. Let us close with the most unsettling scenario that the Great Titan Heist implies. Not for the Imperium, which has always known Orks are dangerous, but for Chaos. Chaos Titans, daemon engines of extraordinary power, are among the most feared weapons in the arsenal of the forces of Chaos. Their physical power rivals any Imperial counterpart. Their daemonic animating intelligence makes them more adaptable and more ferocious than a simple machine could be. And they are, in a very real sense, expressions of the Chaos God's power made manifest in the material world, walking embodiments of destruction and corruption that inspire terror in enemy forces and enthusiasm in their own. But the daemon within a Chaos Titan is not, at its core, invulnerable. It is bound. The Dark Mechanicus rituals that bind it can be broken, or at least strained. The machine's physical systems, however corrupted, can be interfered with. And the daemon itself, for all its fury and power, is an entity of the warp encountering beings the Orks, who are functionally immune to most of its preferred methods of influence. A Chaos Titan that encountered a sufficiently determined and sufficiently talented group of Ork commandos and mech boys would not be dealing with prey that could be intimidated or corrupted. It would be dealing with creatures who would treat the experience of being inside a demon-possessed god machine as an interesting fight, who would, in the Ork psychological framework, be enjoying themselves even as everything around them tried to kill them. And Orks who are enjoying themselves are extremely difficult to dislodge. The daemon within the machine would eventually kill them. In all probability, the physical hazards alone would claim most of a boarding party before they got anywhere near the control systems. And even if they reach the reactor, even if they manage to interfere with it, the result would be something far worse than the Wrath of Cassiopeia's disoriented rampage. It would be a demon freed of the last constraints on its behavior, moving through the burning wreckage of its machine body, now the most dangerous thing in a very wide radius. But here is the thing. The Orks who came up with the plan would not have thought about this part. They would have thought about getting in, finding the big machine, and making something spectacular happen. The spectacular thing happening would validate the endeavor, in Ork logic, regardless of whether they survived to discuss it afterward. And the spores of the dead Orks would drift, and new Orks would grow. And one of them would hear a story about that time. Some boys got into a Chaos Titan and caused absolute chaos, and would think, sounds brilliant. Let us try that again, but bigger. This is the genuine nightmare scenario, not for the Imperium, but for the forces of chaos. Orks who have learned, through accumulated attempts and inherited memories, how to threaten demon engines. Not effectively, not safely, not in a way that produces reliable strategic results, but enthusiastically, repeatedly, and with the kind of bloody-minded persistence that has characterized Ork interaction with everything dangerous they have ever encountered. The Chaos Gods look at the Orks and see something they cannot easily use. Khorne appreciates the violence, certainly, but the Orks' fundamental incompatibility with chaos corruption means they cannot be subverted the way mortal races can. They cannot be recruited. They cannot be promised things they want badly enough to change their fundamental nature. They can only be fought. And fighting Orks is, in the long run, a losing proposition, because Orks do not stay dead. The Great Titan Heist was one event, one botched operation by one Ork warband that achieved catastrophic results through incompetence rather than skill. But it established a precedent, it proved a concept. And in a galaxy where wars last 10,000 years and species outlive individual civilizations, precedents and concepts have a way of being picked up and elaborated on by those who come after, in ways that the original participants never envisioned. Somewhere in the galaxy, a mech boy is looking at something he should not touch, and the thought forming in his brain is very similar to the thought that formed in Mardrug's mech boys when they stood in the maintenance bay on Canto 2 and looked up at the Wrath of Cassiopeia. We could start that. Closing thoughts, the universe that tells these stories. There is a reason that stories like the Great Titan Heist exist in the Warhammer 40k lore, and it is not simply because the writers wanted to include a funny story about Orks among all the grimness. The inclusion of events like this serves a function in the setting. It reminds us that in a universe as vast and as chaotic as the 41st millennium, no faction operates with complete competence, no plan unfolds without unexpected consequences, and no enemy is so powerful that the universe cannot produce something capable of bothering it. The Imperium, for all its might, can be damaged by a handful of green-skinned thieves with improvised tools. Chaos, for all its supernatural power, is not immune to the specific kind of chaos that greenskins introduce into any situation they participate in. The Orks, in this setting, serve a purpose that goes beyond their narrative function as a major faction. They are the setting's reminder that the universe does not care about dignity, that plans collapse, that the most sacred and powerful things in existence, god machines, daemon engines, the war material of ancient civilizations, are not, in the end, safe from the most determined and least appropriate people deciding that they want them. This is, in a very dark way, reassuring. The 41st millennium is a setting of almost unrelenting despair, of humanity's slow defeat under the weight of threats too large to defeat and too numerous to manage. But the Orks are there, wading through all of it, with the same cheerful, violent enthusiasm they bring to everything, entirely unconcerned with the stakes, entirely focused on the fight, entirely prepared to walk into situations that should kill them and be surprised when they do not immediately die. They are, in their own deeply alien way, the most honest inhabitants of the grimdark galaxy. They do not pretend that anything matters beyond the next fight. They do not construct elaborate ideological frameworks to justify their violence. They do not deceive themselves about what they are. They are violence given form, and they are entirely at peace with that. And occasionally, in their cheerful pursuit of the next interesting fight, they stumble into moments that reshape history, that destroy god machines, that disrupt the logistics of entire sectors. That prove, to the quiet horror of everyone watching, that the universe has no truly safe rooms, that even its most powerful weapons are not safe from the curiosity of creatures who simply want to know what happens when you press the big button. The Great Titan Heist is one of those moments. It is ridiculous and catastrophic, and ultimately inconclusive, just like most of what happens in the 41st millennium. And it is, in its own way, a perfect story, because it captures something true about the setting, about the Orks, and about the deeply unheroic way in which some of the most significant events in galactic history actually unfold. Not through grand schemes and noble sacrifice, through a war boss with a big idea, a team of surprisingly skilled greenskins, a maintenance bay on a vulnerable forge world, and a decision to try something that should absolutely not have worked. It did not work. But it was magnificent. And that, in the 41st millennium, is sometimes the best you can hope for. If you made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you spending this time with it. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing these come in from all over the world. If you want more deep dives into the strangest and most fascinating corners of Warhammer 40k lore, hit subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. The universe is full of them, and we are just getting started. This script covers the Great Titan Heist of 981, M41, the Blood Axes, Ork psychology, Titan lore, Chaos Titan corruption, and the broader implications of Ork mechanical ambition. All information is drawn from verified Warhammer 40,000 canon sources, including the Warhammer 40k wiki, the Lexicanum, official codex materials, and campaign supplements. Extended Deep Dive, the architecture of Ork violence. A closer look at how the Green Tide actually works. We touched on Ork society and psychology in the opening sections of this story, but given how central the Ork mindset is to everything that happened during the Great Titan Heist, and given how fundamentally misunderstood the Orks are as a species, it is worth spending considerably more time here, pulling the curtain back further on what is genuinely one of the most fascinating and most terrifying species in the entire Warhammer 40k setting. Let us start with the fact that most of what humanity believes about Orks is wrong. The Imperium's official position on the Orks is that they are a savage, primitive, barely intelligent species, incapable of complex thought or sustained strategic planning. This position is convenient, comforting, and almost completely inaccurate. It is maintained partly because acknowledging the full scope of Ork capability would require admitting things that are deeply uncomfortable for an institution built on the idea of human superiority, and partly because Orks, when encountered in person, are extremely good at appearing exactly as primitive and violent as the Imperium thinks they are. But the Orks were not created by blind evolution. They were engineered. The beings that built them, the Old Ones, the precursor civilization that seeded intelligent life across the galaxy, as part of their effort to resist the Necrons, designed the Orks to be the most effective biological war machine ever created. Every aspect of their biology, their psychology, their social structure, and their technological relationship was deliberately crafted toward a single end, producing a self-sustaining, self-reproducing, nearly indestructible army that would keep fighting indefinitely. The genetic encoding of knowledge in the Ork genome is one of the most remarkable achievements of the Old One's bioengineering. Ork mech boys do not need to be taught engineering. They emerge from the fungal pods that birthed them already knowing, at some level below conscious thought, how to identify mechanical components, how to assess structural integrity, how to envision the flow of energy through systems. They cannot articulate this knowledge in the way a trained engineer could. They cannot write it down or explain the principles, but they can look at a pile of scrap and know instinctively, immediately, in the way that a bird knows how to fly, what can be built from it. This instinctive knowledge is not limited to mech boys. Every Ork has some version of it. Every Ork knows, at a gut level, how to assess the threat level of an opponent, how to judge the structural weaknesses of defensive positions, how to coordinate with other Orks in combat situations without explicit communication. The capacity for Ork boys to form effective tactical units without training or planning is a direct consequence of this engineered instinct. They do not need to be told to outflank. They do not need to be told to concentrate fire on the most dangerous target. They do not need explicit leadership to make reasonable tactical decisions in the moment. They are, in a very real sense, a species where the species itself has already solved most of the problems that conventional militaries spend centuries developing doctrine to address. What they lack is consistency. The instinct is real, but the application is chaotic. Different orcs will make different instinctive assessments of the same situation. In the absence of strong leadership to resolve these conflicts, orc units tend to do slightly different versions of the right thing simultaneously, which is more effective than the wrong thing, but less effective than a coordinated, planned approach. The value of a strong war boss is precisely that he imposes a single, instinctive decision on all these competing ones, channeling the orc's natural capacity into a unified direction. It is also worth understanding the relationship between orc society and conflict from an anthropological perspective, because it is unlike any other society in the 41st millennium. Orc society does not have war as an activity distinct from daily life. War is daily life. The difference between peace and war, for an orc, is approximately the difference between being actively punched and waiting to be punched. The former is simply a more intense version of the latter. Orc settlements, such as they are built around fighting pits, weapon workshops, and the hierarchical structures of the warband. Their economics are organized around literal teeth, knocked out of defeated enemies or rivals, which serve as currency. The political system, as noted, is determined by combat outcomes. This means that an orc society at rest is still a society organized around violence. The violence is just slightly less externally directed. And when a strong war boss channels all that internal violence outward toward external enemies, the effect is something like a pressure valve being opened. All the energy that was going into internal conflict suddenly has a more focused outlet, and the resulting military force is vastly more dangerous than the sum of its individual parts would suggest. The Gork and Mork dynamic is essential to understanding this. The two orc gods, the twin entities born from the orc psychic gestalt, represent the two aspects of orc violence in a way that mirrors the orc's own self-understanding. Gork is the god of brutal cunning, the violence that thinks. The strategic blow, the ambush, the plan that results in maximum damage. Mork is the god of cunning brutality, the violence that feels. The berserker charge, the overwhelming assault, the pure kinetic expression of aggression, both are gods of war. Both are expressions of the same underlying orc nature. The tension between them, the ongoing theological debate among orcs about which god is better and which better represents the orc ideal, is itself a driver of orc cultural energy. The Blood Axes identify more with Mork. Counterintuitively, their cunning is, in the Blood Axe framing, an expression of a more sophisticated violence, a violence that achieves its ends through brains rather than simply through overwhelming force. This is a minority position in orc theology, and it is one of the reasons Blood Axes are regarded with suspicion by clans that lean heavily toward the Gork expression of pure, straightforward aggression. Understanding all of this, the genetic engineering, the psychic field, the theological framework, the social organization, is essential for understanding how Mardrug's plan made sense in the context of the world he lived in. From outside, from an imperial perspective, the plan to steal a warlord titan was absurd. From inside the Blood Axe philosophical framework, it was an ambitious but coherent extrapolation of established principles. Commandos steal things. Mech boys start things. Big things are more impressive than small things. Therefore, stealing and starting a very big thing would be the most impressive possible commando operation. The logic is not sophisticated by human standards, but it is internally consistent by orc standards. And the difference between a plan that sounds reasonable to orcs and one that sounds reasonable to humans is not always as large as either party would like to believe. Extended Deep Dive, the Forge World as Sacred Space, understanding what was lost on Canto 2. To appreciate the full weight of what happened during the Great Titan Heist, we need to spend more time with the Forge World of Canto 2, not just as a strategic asset, but as a place, a culture, and a set of beliefs. A Forge World is, to the Adeptus Mechanicus, not simply a factory. It is a sacred space, The cult Mechanicus, the religion of the Adeptus Mechanicus, holds that knowledge is the highest form of worship, specifically technical knowledge, the understanding of how machines work and how they can be built, maintained, and improved. The machine god, the Omnissiah, is the divine principle behind all mechanical function. Every working engine is a small proof of the Omnissiah's existence. Every standard template construct, the ancient pre-heresy databases that contain the technical specifications for the Imperium's most important technologies, is a holy text. Every tech priest who maintains a functioning system is performing an act of worship. In this theological framework, a forge world is a cathedral. Its production facilities are not factories in any secular sense. They are sacred spaces where ordained priests perform the rites necessary to keep the machine god's work continuing. The tech priests who work there are not engineers in any secular sense. They are clergy, performing rituals that happen to have the side effect of manufacturing weapons and vehicles and the 10,000 other items that the Imperium needs to survive. This means that damage to a forge world is not simply industrial disruption, it is desecration. The Tyrannid attack on Canto II, in the theological framework of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was an act of profound sacrilege, the violation of sacred space by creatures that represented the antithesis of the machine, God's ordered creation. The wounds to the planet's infrastructure were wounds to the body of the divine. The wrath of Cassiopeia's role in the defense of Canto II was therefore not simply military. The Titan was a sacred guardian, the embodiment of the machine, God's power standing in defense of one of his sanctified places. When it fought the Tyrannid Bio-Titans, it was not simply a weapons platform engaging targets. It was, in the deeply sincere belief of every tech priest on the planet, a divine instrument acting according to its sacred purpose. This is why the Titan's loss was so devastating to the survivors of Canto II. Not because of the strategic implications, though those were severe, but because of what it meant spiritually. A god machine had been desecrated. Its machine spirit had been violated by creatures with no right to touch it. It had been turned, however briefly, into an instrument of destruction, directed not by its sacred purpose, but by confusion and pain. And then, it had been destroyed. The tech priests of Canto II, who survived to witness the aftermath, described the period following the Titan heist in terms that would not be out of place in a document describing a religious crisis. Their god had been wounded by the Tyrannids. Then the body of their god had been violated by Orks. Then the spirit of their god had been corrupted into something that turned against its own home. And then, the body had destroyed itself. The mourning rituals that followed the destruction of the wrath of Cassiopeia were extensive. The crater where the Titan fell was eventually consecrated as a site of memorialization. The data cores of the Titan's main systems, those that survived the explosion and could be recovered, were treated as relics, fragments of a saint's remains, preserved against the day when the knowledge they contained might be needed. The princeps, who had not been in his neural interface when the Titan went on its rampage and who survived the event, spent the remainder of his life on Canto II, performing rites of penance, not because the tech priest hierarchy officially blamed him, but because in his own understanding, the bond between a princeps and his Titan is a sacred one, and its ending under these circumstances was a failure he could not absolve himself of. This weight of meaning, the sacred significance of a Titan to the people who serve and maintain it, is something that is easy to miss when you look at a god machine from the outside, from a purely military perspective. From outside, it is a weapons platform. From inside the culture that built and maintains it, it is a living god's avatar, a being of enormous spiritual significance, whose health and welfare is a matter of religious obligation. Mardrug and his commandos had no framework for understanding any of this. They saw a big machine. They wanted to steal it. The cultural and spiritual dimensions of what they were doing were invisible to them, not because they were incapable of cultural awareness. Blood axes are notably more culturally aware than most orcs, but because the specific culture they were dealing with expressed its deepest values through machinery in a way that no orc culture quite parallels. This is not to excuse the orcs. It is to understand them more fully. They were not committing sacrilege with intent. They were simply taking something that looked useful without the conceptual framework to understand that it was anything more than a very large machine. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling thing about the Great Titan heist of all. Not that the Orks were malicious, but that they were completely and utterly indifferent to everything that made the wrath of Cassiopeia sacred. They did not see a god's avatar. They saw a big thing with lots of guns, and they tried to steal it. Extended deep dive. The mechanics of the rampage 40 minutes in detail. The 40-minute rampage of the Wrath of Cassiopeia is documented in more detail than most people realize, partly because several tech priests and other survivors were present and kept records, and partly because the Adeptus Mechanicus's post-event analysis was thorough, even when its conclusions were uncomfortable. The first few minutes, as we have described, were dominated by the Titan's exit from the maintenance complex. This phase established two things immediately. The machine was mobile, and it was not under control. The absence of any crew in the neural interfaces meant that the void shields were not being actively managed. In the excitement of activation, the mech boys had brought the reactor online without bringing the void shield generators fully up to operational status. This was actually fortunate for Canto 2. In a dark and ironic way, an activated Warlord Titan with functioning void shields and weapons online is considerably more dangerous than one that is running primarily on its own locomotion systems and has only partial weapons. Access. The partial weapons access was still, it should be noted, catastrophic. The carapace weapons that came online first were the Apocalypse missile launchers, a system that, under normal circumstances, would be fired in precisely coordinated salvos against specific targets at ranges measured in kilometers. Under the circumstances of the rampage, with no princeps managing targeting and the machine spirit operating on raw instinct, the launchers fired in irregular patterns at whatever triggered the targeting sensors. The first salvos struck the refinery tower that provided much of the manufactory district's promethium processing capacity. The tower, built to survive almost everything except a direct hit from TIE-tangent-grade weapons, did not survive a direct hit from TIE-tangent-grade weapons. The secondary explosions from the promethium reserves created a chain reaction that damaged several surrounding structures before the automated suppression systems eventually contained the fire. The arm-mounted weapons came online more gradually, as different systems achieved sufficient power draw from the plasma reactor. The volcano cannon, the beam weapon, capable of penetrating the void shields of other Titans, discharged twice during the rampage, both times at targets that were selected by what can only be described as the machine spirit's damaged pattern recognition systems, identifying large metallic structures as potential threats. The first discharge struck a communications tower, which was destroyed completely. The second struck the base of an outer wall of the Forge World's primary shrine to the machine god, a massive stone and metal structure that had stood for nearly 400 years and collapsed one section of it. The tech priests who survived reported that the partial destruction of the shrine was, in some ways, the most psychologically devastating moment of the entire event. The Titan they had served, whose defense of the planet against the Tyranids they had celebrated, was now destroying the sacred structures of their faith. The contradiction was almost impossible to process. The Titan's movement patterns during the rampage reflect the confused, partial nature of the machine spirit's sensory data. It did not move in straight lines or in any direction that suggested awareness of a specific objective. It moved in arcs and curves, occasionally retracing its path, occasionally stopping for extended periods, as if the machine spirit was attempting to process something its damaged sensors were providing incompletely. Several witnesses described the machine as looking during these pauses, almost as though it was trying to remember something, head section rotating slowly, weapons not actively tracking, the engine sound changing from the driving rhythm of active movement to something slower and more uncertain. The machine spirit was, the tech priest analysis concluded, attempting to identify its crew. The patterns of its movement and its pauses, analyzed in retrospect, were consistent with a Titan searching for the psychic signature of its princeps in the neural interface, an automatic process, one of the most fundamental functions of the machine spirit, which is oriented always toward the connection with its crew. Finding nothing, it became increasingly distressed. The aggression of its weapon discharges was not precision targeting, but an expression of this distress, the way that a creature in pain lashes out without specific intent. This interpretation is, perhaps, the most sobering thing about the entire event. The wrath of Cassiopeia was not rampaging because it had been turned evil. It was rampaging because it was in pain, because it was alone, because the beings who should have been there, the crew it had spent years learning to work with, the princeps whose thoughts should have been anchoring its consciousness, were absent. And in that aloneness, with its systems damaged and its sensory data corrupted, and the Ork boarding party creating chaos in its internal spaces, the machine spirit defaulted to the most basic thing it knew: combat. The second half of the rampage, from approximately 20 minutes onward, showed increasing instability in the machine's systems. The plasma reactor, driven hard by the activation process and operating without the careful management that the crew would normally provide, was building thermal stress that the Titan's cooling systems were not designed to handle at this rate. The Tech Priest analysis describes a cascade of small system failures in the final 10 minutes, coolant systems beginning to fail, power regulation systems compensating inadequately, weapon systems drawing power that was needed for other functions. The machine spirit, in those final minutes, seems to have understood what was happening. The analysis of the machine's final movements suggests a deliberate attempt to move away from the most populated areas of the facility, away from the remaining structures, toward the open ground at the edge of the manufactory district. Whether this was a conscious decision by the machine spirit to minimize further collateral damage, or simply the result of the machine's locomotion systems malfunctioning in ways that happened to send it in that direction, cannot be determined with certainty. What can be determined is that the final location of the Titan, when its reactor overloaded, was approximately 400 meters from any occupied building, and that the size of the explosion, while enormous, was less than it would have been had the machine been closer to the Forge World's fuel and ammunition reserves. The subsequent crater was 60 meters across and 12 meters deep at its center. Within a radius of approximately 200 meters, no structure of any kind survived. Beyond that radius, the damage was extensive but recoverable. The Forge World survived the event. It survived in a damaged state, its production capacity severely reduced, its sacred structures partially destroyed, its surviving population traumatized. But it survived. Whether the machine spirit of the wrath of Cassiopeia, in its final moments of existence, made a choice that contributed to that survival is something that the Tech Priest survivors debated for years afterward. The cult Mechanicus does not officially recognize the possibility that a machine spirit can make ethical decisions. The theology holds that machine spirits are manifestations of the Omnissiah's will, operating according to sacred purpose rather than autonomous moral reasoning. But the survivors knew what they had seen, and many of them believed, privately, that the God machine had moved itself to die where it would cause the least additional harm. Extended Deep Dive, The Long Shadow, How the Titan Heist Resonated Through Subsequent Events. The Great Titan Heist did not exist in isolation. It occurred within a specific moment in the ongoing history of the 41st millennium, a period of extraordinary pressure on the Imperium from multiple directions simultaneously, and its consequences interacted with those broader pressures in ways that amplified its effects beyond what the event itself would have produced in quieter times. The late 41st millennium is a period of escalating crisis for the Imperium. The birth of the Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning tear in reality that came to be known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, was still a century away from our story, but the conditions that would produce it were already building. Chaos incursions were increasing in frequency and intensity. Necron tomb worlds were awakening. Tyrannid splinter fleets, advanced elements of the massive hive fleets that were converging on the galaxy, were striking at increasing numbers of systems. In this context, the capacity of a Forge world like Canto II was not simply valuable, it was critical. The supply chains of the Imperium are not graceful or elegant. They are massive, cumbersome, slow, and entirely dependent on specific production nodes maintaining their output. When a node goes down, the effects are felt immediately in the nearest military fronts, and then propagate outward as stockpiles are depleted and replacements do not arrive. The disruption to Canto II's output arrived at a moment when several of the neighboring sectors were already dealing with elevated threat levels. The knock-on effects were difficult to trace through the historical record. Imperial logistics documentation is not designed for post-hoc analysis of causal chains, but the patterns are there for those who look. Operations that should have been completed in months stretched to years. Reinforcement requests that should have been filled within normal timeframes went unfilled for extended periods. Defensive lines that were supposed to be rebuilt and stabilized remained porous. In the specific case of the Tau border engagements that were ongoing during this period, the supply disruption from Canto II contributed to a situation in which several Imperial Guard regiments found themselves critically short of artillery ammunition at a moment when the Tau were pressing their advantage. The resulting Imperial withdrawals from 3 contested systems were not catastrophic. In a strategic sense, the systems were eventually retaken, but the delay allowed the Tau to establish footholds that required years of subsequent effort to remove. Nobody at the Tau border knew about the Ork theft attempt on Canto II. The commanders dealing with the artillery shortage attributed it to logistics failure and bureaucratic inefficiency, which was not entirely wrong. The tech priests on Canto II were not thinking about the Tau border when they were documenting the loss of their manufacturing capacity. The connection between the two events existed in the universe, but not in any individual's awareness. This is the nature of the 41st millennium. It is too large, too complex, too full of competing actors and cascading consequences for any individual or institution to hold its full shape in mind at once. The Imperium functions, insofar as it functions, through the accumulation of countless individual decisions and events that none of its administrators can fully track, producing outcomes that are sometimes acceptable and sometimes catastrophic, and usually somewhere in between. The Great Titan Heist sits in this web of causation as one node among many significant in its specific effects, invisible in its broader consequences, understood by none of the parties whose fates it influenced. Mardrug, wherever he went after Canto II, presumably never knew that his failed theft attempt had contributed to the loss of 3 border systems on the Tau frontier. He knew he had driven a giant machine around for a while and then gotten out before it exploded. In the Blood Axe oral tradition, this is a triumph. In the ledger of the 41st millennium's casualties, the ripple effects extended much further than he ever imagined. This is not unique to the Great Titan Heist. This is how the universe works. Every action produces consequences that exceed the actor's awareness and intention. Every theft, every battle, every botched heist, every rampage contributes to the vast accumulation of pressure and damage and adaptation that constitutes the history of the far future. And in this specific case, the contribution came from Orks, who wanted a Titan and got more than they bargained for. Final extension, Voices from the Records, reconstructing the Titan Heist through its sources. Any historical reconstruction is only as good as its sources, and the sources for the Great Titan Heist are a fascinating collection of documents with very different characters and very different perspectives on what happened. The primary Imperial source is the Canto II Incident Report, filed by the surviving senior tech priest of the Forge World approximately 6 months after the event. This document is notable for its extreme technical precision. The damage assessments are highly specific, the loss inventories are meticulously cataloged, and for its almost complete absence of any discussion of emotion or meaning. In the Adeptus Mechanicus style, the spiritual devastation of the event is compressed into a single phrase, describing the loss of the Wrath of Cassiopeia as having deeply affected the personnel of the facility, with no further elaboration. The inquisitorial summary is a somewhat different document. Filed by an Ordo Xenos investigator dispatched to Canto II after the incident, it focuses on the tactical and strategic implications of the event, specifically on the question of how Orks had managed to infiltrate a Forge world and interface with a Titan, and what this suggested about the evolution of Ork military capabilities. The summary is blunt in ways that the Adeptus Mechanicus report is not, noting explicitly that the event demonstrated that current threat assessments for Blood Axe warbands in the region were inadequate and recommending a review. The review was conducted, filed, and then quietly archived in a facility on a world that was subsequently lost to a different threat entirely, its contents inaccessible for the next several decades. This is also characteristic of the Imperium. The Blood Axe oral tradition provides the third major source perspective. This is not a single document, but a pattern of stories, reconstructed from accounts gathered by Adeptus Mechanicus analysts during subsequent encounters with Blood Axe warbands in the region. The stories vary in detail, but are consistent in outline. They emphasize the audacity of the plan, the skill of the commandos, the brilliance of the mech boys in starting the machine, and the magnificent destruction that followed. The stories do not mention that the mission failed to achieve its stated objective. They mention, with great satisfaction, the size of the explosion at the end. These three perspectives together create something approaching a complete picture, though the gaps between them are as informative as the overlaps. The Imperial sources are precise about physical facts and almost silent about meaning. The Blood Axe sources are expansive about meaning and creative with physical facts. The truth, as usual in the 41st millennium, is somewhere in the space between them, a set of actual events that have been layered over by the needs of different kinds of stories. The actual Orks who participated in the Titan heist are not individually documented in any surviving source. We know Mardrug's name because he was the war boss, and his name was significant enough to be noted in the inquisitorial summary. We do not know the names of the commandos, the mech boys, the greenskin equivalent of the boarding party's individuals, because Orks are not the kind of species that keeps personnel records, and the Imperial sources had no mechanism for learning who specifically had been involved. This is, in a way, very characteristic of how Ork history works. The deeds are documented, if indirectly. The doers are mostly anonymous. The Ork who first touched the wrath of Cassiopeia's control systems and started the sequence that would end in a 60-meter crater, that specific individual's name, if they had one beyond whatever the other Orks called them, is lost. What remains is the consequence, the reverberating echo of an action in the universe's causal record. This, too, is the 41st millennium in miniature. Most of the history of that era was made by people and Orks who left no name on the record, only the effects of what they did. The named figures, the heroes and villains and legendary warriors whose stories are told in the codices and the histories, are the exceptions. The reality of that universe is 10 trillion nameless individuals making decisions that collectively shape a galactic civilization's fate, each one invisible in themselves, but contributing to patterns that are visible only from an enormous distance. The Ork who touched the reactor controls on Canto 2 is one of those nameless individuals. What they touched is history. A note on Chaos Titans in the broader Ork context. Before we close this extended examination of the Great Titan Heist and its significance, it is worth making explicit something that has been implicit throughout. The event that gave this story its name, the capturing of a Chaos Titan, is not precisely what happened at Canto 2. The Wrath of Cassiopea was an Imperial Titan, not a Chaos Titan. The distinction matters because the two types of machine are fundamentally different in the ways we have discussed, different in their machine spirits, different in the nature of the consciousness that animates them, different in their behavior under conditions of mismanagement and boarding actions. The framing of this story around Chaos Titans, rather than Imperial Titans, reflects the broader lore question that the Canto 2 incident implies. If Orks could attempt this against an Imperial god machine, what would happen if they attempted something similar against a Chaos Titan? What are the unique challenges and unique catastrophic possibilities of an Ork boarding action on a demon engine? The answer, as we have explored, involves the difference between a machine spirit that is distressed and lashes out defensively, and a daemon that is furious and responds with full hostile intent. An Imperial Titan in distress is dangerous. A Chaos Titan, with its demon freed from full control constraints, would be something substantially worse. But the Orks would try it anyway. This is not speculation, but a reasonable extrapolation from everything we know about Ork culture and psychology. Orks are attracted to dangerous things. Chaos Titans are maximally dangerous. The logic, from inside the Ork framework, is almost compellingly clear. The more dangerous the thing, the better the fight, and the better the story, if you survive. And the universe of Warhammer 40k is large enough, and has been running long enough, that somewhere in its millions of documented and undocumented conflicts, Orks have almost certainly attempted it. The records are sparse, the outcomes presumably catastrophic, and the survivors, where there were any, were not inclined to file detailed reports. But somewhere in the darkness between the stars, there is a crater or a wreck or a scorched and haunted piece of ground that marks the place where an Ork mech boy looked at a Chaos Titan and thought, we could start that. This is, in the end, the most purely Ork thing about the entire story. Not the plan, not the execution, not even the spectacular failure. It is the look in the mech boy's eyes when he sees the machine, that particular combination of desire and confidence, and complete absence of any self-preserving hesitation that defines the greenskins. They look at the most dangerous things in the universe and see not threats to be avoided, but challenges to be met, machines to be started, fights to be had, stories to be told. The galaxy, for all its darkness, would be a slightly less interesting place without them. And with that, we have reached the end of this particular story, a story about theft, ambition, ancient machines, and the deep, irreducible absurdity of a universe where god engines can be brought low, not by other god engines, not by the forces of chaos or the hunger of the Tyranids, but by a group of greenskins with tools and determination, and not enough sense to know what they could not do. They almost did it, and the almost was spectacular. That is the Ork way. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that might be the most honest thing anyone says about anything. If you made it this far, you are absolutely one of the dedicated ones. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is. And if you have not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There is so much more where this came from. The final word, blood axes, chaos, and the definition of victory. There is a conversation that surfaces, if you spend enough time in the corners of Warhammer 40k lore that deal with the Orks, about what victory actually means for the Green Tide. It is a conversation that the Imperium does not want to have, the Eldar have already had and found deeply disturbing, and the Chaos Gods participate in by indirection, through the way their daemons respond when they encounter Orks in the field. The conversation is this: can the Orks actually lose? Not in any individual engagement. Obviously, Orks die. Ork warbands are destroyed. Ork invasions are defeated, turned back, crushed under sufficient application of Imperial firepower and coordination. The Orks lost at Ulanor eventually. After the War of the Beast had consumed more resources and lives than almost any other conflict in the Imperium's history. The Orks lose battles constantly. Death is extremely familiar to every Ork alive. But can the Orks, as a species, as a civilization, as a force in the galaxy, be defeated? Can you win against them in any permanent or meaningful sense? The answer, by almost any analytical framework, is no. You cannot. You can reduce their numbers. You can shatter their crusades. You can kill their warlords and scatter their warbands and reclaim the worlds they have infested. But you cannot stop the spores. You cannot purge the genetic memory of how to build weapons and how to fight. You cannot take away the collective psychic field that makes their technology work and their belief self-fulfilling. You cannot, short of destroying the galaxy entirely, eliminate the conditions that produce Orks. And so every victory over the Orks is temporary. Every cleared world will eventually see new Orks growing from the spores that the previous Orks left behind. Every shattered warband will eventually coalesce again around a new war boss. Every crusade that is broken will eventually rebuild itself, stronger than before, fed by the psychic energy of the conflict itself. The Great Titan Heist, viewed in this light, is not a story about failure. It is a story about the natural rhythm of Ork interaction with the galaxy. The Orks tried something. It did not work exactly as planned. Significant destruction occurred anyway. The Orks left. They will try something else, something bigger, probably. Something that should be even less possible, but which mech boys will attempt anyway, because the genetic encoding in their cells tells them they can, and the psychic field of the Horde backs up that instinct with enough reality-bending force to give it a fighting chance. The Chaos comparison is instructive here. The Chaos Gods thrive on the suffering of mortals, on the corruption of the innocent, on the promises they make and break and remake in slightly more devastating forms. But they cannot corrupt Orks. They cannot promise things that Orks want badly enough to sell themselves for. They cannot subvert the Ork psychic field, or the Ork gods, or the deep biological engineering that makes the greenskins what they are. The Chaos Gods look at the Orks and see something they can use as a weapon, sometimes directed at mutual enemies but cannot control, cannot corrupt, cannot fundamentally change. This is why Khorne resurrects Tuska and his warband every dawn. Not out of affection, though there may be something approaching respect in the blood, God's attention to the Daemon Killer's eternal battle. But because Tuska and his orcs provide Khorne with something the blood god values above almost anything else, an enemy that will never stop fighting, never surrender, never be broken. In Khorne's theology, the ideal of blood and skulls and endless battle is expressed perfectly by creatures who literally cannot stop. The Orks, in their interaction with chaos at the Great Titan Heist and elsewhere, demonstrate something important about the nature of resilience in the 40k universe. True resilience is not the ability to survive unchanged. It is the ability to keep going despite change, despite loss, despite the collapse of specific plans and specific individuals and specific moments of apparent success. The Orks lose constantly. They keep going anyway, with the same enthusiasm, the same conviction, the same absolute certainty that the next fight will be even better than the last one. Warboss Mardrug lost the Great Titan Heist. The Titan he wanted to steal was destroyed. His boarding team barely got out alive. The plan that must have seemed, in its conception, like the most brilliant thing any orc had ever attempted, ended in a crater. And then the orcs went back to their ship, and they flew away. And somewhere on that ship, someone started telling the story of the time they got inside a god machine, and the machine spirit went crazy, and the whole thing exploded in the most spectacular way anyone had ever seen. And the other orcs listened, and their eyes lit up with that particular orc expression that sits somewhere between admiration and competitive jealousy. And someone said, "We should do something like that again, but bigger." And the universe of Warhammer 40k kept turning, because that is what it does. The wars continued. New warlords rose. New threats emerged. New plans were made by people who did not know about the plans that had already been made, and who would not have been deterred by their failure if they had known. The galaxy kept grinding forward in its endless cycle of conflict and loss, and occasional unexpected magnificent moments of absurdity that cut through the grimness like a beam of plasma through a manufactorum wall. The Great Titan Heist is one of those moments. It is a story that makes the universe feel larger for containing it. A universe in which this kind of thing can happen, in which the most sacred war machines of an ancient military tradition can be temporarily stolen by creatures who do not understand what they are dealing with and cause spectacular, collateral damage in the process of failing to steal them, is a universe that has not settled into the comfortable grimness of a setting where only the expected happens. And it is a universe where the orcs are still out there, still growing, still fighting, still looking at things that should not be stolen and thinking, we could steal that. The galaxy has not heard the last of them. It never does. If you made it this far, you are the kind of lore diver this channel exists for. Every comment, every subscription, every share of this video helps keep these deep dives coming. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this one, from the strangest and most fascinating corners of the 41st millennium, subscribe and make sure notifications are on, because there is always another story waiting to be told. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is the richest, strangest, most detailed fictional universe ever constructed. We have barely scratched the surface. See you in the next one. Supplemental: the mechanics of orc belief and why they almost succeeded. There is a detail buried in the technical analysis of the Great Titan Heist that deserves its own extended treatment because it gets at something fundamental about how the orc species interacts with the physical world and why their attempt to start a warlord titan was, despite its ultimate failure, considerably more credible than it had any right to be. We have discussed the orc psychic gestalt. We have described how shared orc belief bends reality, how red vehicles go faster because orcs believe they do, how orc weapons work despite violating the laws of physics because orcs collectively expect them to. But the mechanism of this, the actual process by which orc belief interacts with the material world, is worth examining more carefully because it has direct bearing on what happened inside the Wrath of Cassiopeia. The orc psychic gestalt is not uniform. It does not apply equal force to all things equally. It is strongest in areas that orcs collectively focus on, areas where large numbers of orcs share the same specific belief about the same specific thing. It is weaker in areas where orc belief is divided or uncertain. And it is mediated by the mech boys in a specific way. Mech boys are natural amplifiers and directors of the gestalt's technical applications. When a mech boy approaches a mechanical system with the conviction that it can be made to work, the ambient psychic energy of the Ork collective is channeled through that conviction in a way that actively nudges physical reality toward the expected outcome. This is why the mech boys almost started the Wrath of Cassiopeia correctly. Not because of technical skill that exceeded their apparent capability, though their instinctive understanding of mechanical systems was genuine, but because the psychic field they projected, the collective conviction of the boarding team that the machine would start, actually interacted with the Titan's systems at a level that bypassed some of the technical barriers that should have prevented the activation. The tech priest analysis of the incident noted something puzzling in the physical evidence. The sequence of activations in the Titan's reactor systems did not follow any of the known improper activation sequences that could have been produced by random interference. Several of the steps in the sequence corresponded to the correct activation procedure in ways that would have been essentially impossible to reproduce by random chance, but which the mech boys could not have known to perform correctly. The analysis concluded, with considerable reluctance, that something beyond technical knowledge had guided the activation that the systems had, in some sense, cooperated with the mech boys in ways that were not entirely explicable by the physical inputs. This is profoundly disturbing to the Adeptus Mechanicus, because it suggests that the machine spirit of the Wrath of Cassiopeia was, at some level, influenced by the Ork psychic field during the activation sequence. That the ancient, proud machine spirit of a sacred god machine was nudged, even partially, by the ambient conviction of a boarding party of greenskins. The implications ripple outward in uncomfortable directions. If an Imperial Titan's machine spirit can be influenced by Ork psychic projection, what does this mean for Chaos Titans? The daemon within a Chaos Titan is a more active and more aggressive entity than a machine spirit. But is it immune to the specific way the Ork gestalt functions? The Ork field does not corrupt. It does not tempt. It does not offer deals or make promises. It simply insists that things will work, and bends reality slightly in the direction of that insistence. A daemon can resist temptation and resist corruption because it has its own agenda and its own power. But can it resist a form of psychic influence that does not try to change its nature, only the behavior of the mechanical systems around it? The answer is genuinely uncertain. And that uncertainty is, for anyone thinking seriously about the threat that skilled Ork mech boys represent to chaos war machines, something that should feature prominently in any threat assessment. There is an additional layer to this that the oral tradition adds. The Blood Axe accounts of the Titan heist consistently describe a moment, shortly after the reactor activation, when several of the mech boys reported feeling that the machine was communicating with them, not in words, not in any coherent transmission, but in the way that machines communicate in the Ork understanding of the world, through the way systems respond, through the feedback of operational machinery, through the subtle pushes and resistances of a mechanical environment. The machine spirit, in its distressed and disoriented state, was apparently attempting to interface with the beings that had activated it, in the only way available to it, given that its proper crew was absent and its control systems were in Ork hands. The mech boys did not understand what this meant. They interpreted it, characteristically, as the machine complaining about what they were doing to it. They interpreted the machine spirit's attempts to communicate as resistance, to be overcome, rather than contact to be engaged with. They responded by hitting more things, and the machine spirit, receiving no coherent response to its attempts at interface, defaulted to the autonomous behavior that ultimately produced the rampage. What would have happened if, hypothetically, the boarding team had included a mech boy sophisticated enough to recognize what the machine spirit was doing and attempt to respond to it? Could an Ork have interfaced with an Imperial Titan's machine spirit in a way that produced actual control rather than chaos? The Adeptus Mechanicus would say no, emphatically, for both technical and theological reasons. The Ork gestalt field is not compatible with the sacred rites of activation. The machine spirit would not accept control from a being without the proper neural implants. The attempt would fail, but the Adeptus Mechanicus's certainty on this point is not uniformly shared by those who have studied the Titan heist in detail. The events on Canto 2 demonstrated that at least one form of compatibility already existed, that Ork psychic projection had already influenced the machine spirit's activation in ways the Mechanicus had not anticipated. The ground for further, stranger interactions was already being broken. These are, ultimately, questions that the 41st millennium will continue to pose and refuse to answer cleanly. The universe of Warhammer 40k is not one that provides neat resolutions to its most provocative implications. It raises them and lets them sit, unresolved, contributing to the atmospheric pressure of a setting in which everything that seems settled is never quite settled, and everything that seems impossible has a way of becoming merely very difficult, and then merely difficult, and then merely the next thing someone decides to try. The Orks are the galaxy's most determined teachers of this lesson. They look at impossibility and see a challenge. They meet the universe's insistence that certain things cannot be done with their own insistence, that they absolutely can, and they bring enough psychic weight behind that insistence to make the universe blink first, at least some of the time. The Wrath of Cassiopeia was started by Orks. It ran for 40 minutes before destroying itself. That it did not achieve the outcome Mardrug intended does not change the fact that it happened that something the Adeptus Mechanicus had considered fundamentally impossible became, for 40 spectacular minutes, undeniably real. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is full of moments like this. And every single one of them is worth understanding, because in the accumulation of the impossible made briefly real, in the pressure of the Ork gestalt against the walls of what should be true, something about the nature of this universe becomes clear, that it is more permeable than it appears, more responsive to conviction and belief than the cold mechanics of its technologies suggest, and more surprising, always more surprising than any strategic analysis prepared by any faction can fully anticipate. That is the lesson of the Great Titan Heist. That is the lesson the Orks have always been teaching, to anyone willing to pay attention. Not that they are unstoppable, they are not, individually. Not that their plans always work, they do not, spectacularly. But that the universe bends toward conviction, and the Orks have more conviction than anything else in the galaxy, and someday, somewhere, one of those plans is going to work perfectly. And on that day, everyone who did not take the Orks seriously enough is going to wish they had.